a city scarred by his empire, the name Escobar still haunts the streets, a reminder of power, fear, and the cost of ambition. But after years of bloodshed and betrayal, how did the king of cocaine finally meet his end? And what legacy did he leave behind in his wake? In the heart of Medellin, Colombia, where the steep hills meet the misty sky, a young boy named Pablo Escobar was beginning his journey towards greatness. The streets of the city were rough, lined with the scars of poverty and crime. But even in this raw landscape, something in Pablo stood out. He wasn't like the other children who played soccer or raced bikes in the alleyways. Instead, Pablo had an unshakable drive, a hunger for more than the life his neighborhood offered. Pablo grew up in the small, tight-knit community of Envigado, where his family struggled to make ends meet. His mother, a schoolteacher, worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat, while his father, a farmer, instilled in him a hard-working mentality. But it was the streets that shaped Pablo. The people around him, from the local hustlers to the minor criminals, became his early teachers. They showed him how the world worked, not with rules but with power. It was a place where the strongest survived and the quickest thrived. In this world, Pablo learned how to hustle before he even knew what it meant. As a young boy, he quickly became known for his sharp mind and ability to spot an opportunity. He wasn't interested in playing by the rules that society set out. Instead, he saw every rule as something to be bent or broken for his own gain. By the age of 12, he was already involved in petty crime, stealing gravestones, scraping off the names, and selling them back to the grieving families. It was a dark hustle, but it taught him the value of turning something discarded into profit. Pablo didn't just hustle for money, he hustled for respect. There was an aura about him that made people trust him. He was calm, calculated, and always delivered what he promised. Even in the roughest parts of Medellin, people took notice of this boy who had a way of getting things done, quietly, without fuss. He wasn't loud or brash. He simply made things happen, and that was enough to make him someone worth knowing. It wasn't long before Pablo realized that power wasn't just about having money. It was about making people see you as essential. He watched local politicians, their black cars rolling through the streets with tinted windows and armed guards. People bowed their heads in respect, but Pablo understood something deeper. Power wasn't about fear alone. It was about influence. To get that, he needed to perform. He needed to be seen as the man who could give people what they wanted, whether it was protection, wealth, or a little bit of hope in a city that had so little of it. And so, the boy who started with a stolen gravestone would one day build an empire that would make the world tremble. But that was still a long way off. For now, he was just a young man, a product of his environment, learning the ropes and getting ready to take the world by storm. Medellin, a city tucked in the mountains of Colombia, pulsed with life, a life defined by struggle, where the streets were paved with both hope and despair. For many, survival was a daily calculation. For Pablo Escobar, it was the perfect playground. From a young age, he knew the rules of this world were simple. Take what you can, and never trust anyone but yourself. He didn't have the luxury of learning through trial and error. Every mistake could cost him everything, so he learned quickly to calculate risk, to see beyond the immediate, and to always think 2 steps ahead. The city was a maze of alleys and narrow streets, each corner offering a new opportunity, a new deal. By the time Pablo was 14, he had already built his first network. The neighborhood kids looked up to him not just for his street smarts, but for his ability to get things done. Whether it was moving stolen goods, selling fake diplomas, or smuggling cigarettes, Pablo's entrepreneurial spirit made him stand out. But it wasn't just the hustle that made him dangerous. It was his ability to read people, to understand what made them tick and use it to his advantage. He had a knack for sizing up risk. In a world where danger was as common as the sun, Pablo learned to navigate the criminal underworld with a quiet precision. He didn't make rash moves. Every step was measured, every word calculated. He knew who to talk to, who to trust, and who to avoid. In his early ventures, there were moments of risk, but Pablo thrived in those moments, learning quickly that calculated moves brought great rewards. Pablo's first real taste of the criminal life came when he started working for the local cocaine dealers, learning how to move the product with finesse. Cocaine was becoming a commodity, and Medellin was one of its main hubs. The money was unbelievable, and for someone like Pablo, who had always been good at turning small profits into bigger ones, it was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. But what set him apart from others in the game wasn't just his ability to make money, it was his understanding of power. Unlike the other low-level smugglers and dealers, Pablo wasn't just selling drugs. He was building relationships, earning loyalty, and cultivating a reputation. He knew the value of silence in a city that thrived on secrets, and he used that to his advantage. In time, his operations grew. He started making bigger deals, expanding his network, and carving out his territory. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of the bigger players, the ones who saw him as a threat or an asset, depending on which side of the table you were on. By the time Pablo was in his 20s, his name was already starting to circulate in the darker corners of Medellin, and though his rise through the ranks of crime had been swift, it had been anything but reckless. Every move he made was intentional, calculated. In a city where danger was just as familiar as the air you breathed, Pablo Escobar had become a master at playing the game, and he was just getting started. Pablo Escobar was never just a street kid looking to make a quick buck. From an early age, he understood something that most others didn't. Business wasn't just about making money. It was about seeing opportunities where others saw nothing. He didn't need a formal education or mentors to understand this. The streets of Medellin taught him everything he needed to know. He learned early on that survival wasn't enough. To thrive, you had to be smarter, faster, and always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. His first ventures into crime were small but strategic. Smuggling cigarettes was one of his earliest hustles. He quickly realized the power of moving goods undetected, how much money could be made from a simple package crossing a border. But it wasn't just the physical hustle of transporting contraband that intrigued him. It was the intricate network of people behind the scenes. Smuggling wasn't just about what you carried. It was about who you knew, who trusted you, and who you could pay to look the other way. He wasn't just learning how to make a deal. He was learning how to manage it, how to work the system. Pablo had a unique way of understanding value. In a city where survival often depended on street smarts, he saw what others missed, the untapped potential in the most ordinary of commodities. He saw how to take a simple product and elevate it to something more. A pack of cigarettes, a few crates of goods, an old car, none of these were just items to him. They were assets, opportunities waiting to be leveraged. He didn't just buy, sell, or smuggle. He turned everything into a business deal. A broken-down car became a fast getaway. A hidden crate turned into a money-making machine. By the time he was in his late teens, Pablo was no longer just moving small-scale contraband. He had begun connecting the dots between different parts of the criminal underworld, forging relationships with other players, both big and small. He became known not only for his reliability but for his uncanny ability to turn even the most mundane job into a profit. Whether it was dealing in stolen goods, running numbers, or moving shipments of liquor, Pablo understood that it wasn't about the product, it was about the process. The hustle was the game. He had learned how to turn risks into rewards, how to navigate danger with cold calculation. But it wasn't just street-level deals that captivated him. He had a broader vision, one that reached beyond the boundaries of Medellin. As his small operations grew, so did his ambitions. He began to see a bigger picture, a global network of trade, smuggling, and illicit goods. It wasn't long before he moved from petty hustles to the high-stakes world of international cocaine trafficking. But even in the early days, as a small-time hustler, Pablo's mind was always working, always calculating. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was positioning himself for something much bigger. Pablo Escobar's rise to power wasn't an accident. It was a carefully executed plan, each move calculated like pieces on a chessboard. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already mastered the streets of Medellin and the art of hustling. But while others in his world were content with small-time profits, Pablo saw a much bigger opportunity. He saw cocaine. It wasn't just the drug itself that appealed to him, it was the margins. The risks were higher, sure, but the rewards were unparalleled. In the mid-1970s, cocaine was starting to make its way into the United States. While most drug traffickers saw it as too risky, too costly to deal with, Pablo saw the exact opposite. He saw it as an untapped market, a new frontier. Cocaine was lightweight, high margin, and addictive. And for someone with Pablo's mind, it was the perfect product to push across borders. But to make it work, he needed more than just a good business idea. He needed infrastructure. Pablo didn't just jump into the cocaine game. He built it from the ground up. The first thing he needed was a supply chain. He didn't just want to buy cocaine from someone else. He wanted to control every part of the process. So, he set up his own labs, hidden deep in the jungles of Antioquia. The first lab was crude, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the product's purity and the profits it could generate. Pablo wasn't content with small backroom operations. He invested in planes, pilots, and routes. He recruited locals, offering them more than just money. He offered them power, protection, and a way out of poverty. Soon, his network of loyalists grew, and so did his operation. His strategic mind was evident in the way he ran his business. He wasn't just a dealer, he was a businessman. He knew how to manage risk, how to expand, how to ensure the product moved without attracting too much attention. He understood that power was just as much about perception as it was about muscle. So, while other cartels operated in the shadows, Pablo made sure that people knew his name. He cultivated a network of law enforcement officers, judges, and politicians. He built relationships that would ensure his success, because Pablo knew that, in the world he was entering, money alone wasn't enough. You needed to be untouchable. As his operation expanded, so did his influence. By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a small-time smuggler. He had become a key player in the global cocaine trade. His empire stretched from Colombia to the United States, and his wealth was growing at an exponential rate. But what set him apart from the rest wasn't just his business acumen, it was his understanding of the game. He knew that loyalty was just as important as money, that fear could be used to control entire cities. His cartel wasn't just a business, it was a kingdom built on loyalty, violence, and strategy. And Pablo, the king, was just getting started. Pablo Escobar's first major drug deal wasn't just a transaction, it was the moment the world started to understand the magnitude of his ambition. Up until then, he had been working his way up through small-time smuggling, moving contraband and building connections. But it was cocaine that would cement his place in the criminal underworld. The first big deal came in the late 1970s, a time when the drug was still relatively unknown in the United States. But for Pablo, it wasn't about the product alone. It was about timing, strategy, and the ability to make the right connections. The deal was ambitious, even by his standards. It involved a shipment of cocaine that would be transported from Colombia to the United States, and Pablo needed everything to go smoothly. He wasn't just dealing with product, he was navigating a labyrinth of trust, secrecy, and danger. This wasn't just about selling drugs, It was about making an indelible mark on an industry that was ripe for the taking. But Pablo wasn't working alone. He had already begun building a network of allies who would help him make the leap from small-time hustler to kingpin. One of the first connections he made was with the Ochoa family, powerful figures in the Medellin area who had been involved in the drug trade for years. They had the experience and the connections to expand Pablo's operations, but they also needed someone they could trust, someone who could handle the logistics and the risk. Pablo was that man. Through a series of strategic moves, he managed to gain their trust, proving that his mind wasn't just sharp, it was ruthless when necessary. He understood that in this business, you didn't just sell a product, you sold loyalty, you sold silence. The deal itself was executed with military precision. Pablo had secured pilots, smuggling routes, and a network of loyal men who would protect the shipment at any cost. The plan was simple: get the cocaine into the hands of the right buyers, avoid detection, and keep a low profile. In a world where law enforcement was often compromised or outgunned, the real challenge was ensuring that the network held together. And for Pablo, that meant staying ahead of every possible threat, from rival cartels to corrupt officials. The deal was a resounding success. The shipment made it across the border, and the money that followed was unlike anything Pablo had ever seen before. But the real payoff wasn't just in cash, it was in the trust and connections he gained from that first deal. Pablo had proved to the Ochoas and other key players in the cocaine trade that he was more than just a smuggler. He was a businessman, a man capable of navigating the complexities of the drug trade with a combination of intelligence and fearlessness that few could match. That first big deal marked the beginning of something larger than Pablo Escobar ever imagined. It was the moment he crossed from the streets of Medellin to the global stage, and from that moment on, the world would never be the same. As Pablo Escobar's success in the cocaine trade grew, so did his ambition. The first big deal had proved his ability to move vast quantities of cocaine across international borders, but Pablo was far from satisfied. He knew that power in this world didn't come from just having money. It came from control, from building an empire that stretched far beyond the borders of Medellin. To do that, he had to expand his network, solidify his alliances, and ensure that no one could threaten his reign. Escobar's expansion began quietly but quickly picked up speed. Medellin was his base, but he knew that to truly dominate the drug trade, he had to control the entire supply chain. He wasn't just dealing with small-scale shipments anymore. He was planning to flood the United States with cocaine, and to do that, he needed an infrastructure that could support the vast quantities he intended to move. He started securing airstrips, renting warehouses, and establishing contacts in key locations like the Bahamas and Panama, where shipments could be funneled into the U.S. He also ensured that his supply routes were constantly evolving, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement or rival cartels to track his shipments. But even more important than logistics was loyalty. Pablo understood that his empire could only grow if he surrounded himself with people he could trust completely. He needed men who were just as ruthless and calculating as he was, men who would fight for him, work for him, and die for him if necessary. To this end, he recruited his trusted lieutenants, men like Gustavo Gaviria, his cousin, and others who shared his vision and could help him expand his operations. These men weren't just partners, they were the pillars upon which his empire would stand. They handled everything from logistics to security, ensuring that each part of the operation ran smoothly. As his network grew, so did the number of men he controlled. Escobar wasn't just running a drug operation, he was building an army. His lieutenants recruited local enforcers, young men from the barrios of Medellin who were hungry for power and money. They became his sicarios, his hitmen, and his muscle. They weren't just thugs, they were loyal soldiers, and Pablo made sure they understood the rules of the empire. Loyalty was everything. Betrayal was punishable by death. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar had more than just a drug cartel. He had an empire that spanned continents. His Medellin cartel was responsible for the bulk of the cocaine entering the United States, and he controlled not only the supply but the distribution network. His influence reached into politics, law enforcement, and even the media. Politicians took his bribes, the police turned a blind eye to his operations, and the people of Medellin, for the most part, viewed him as a patron who gave back to the community. He built houses, funded schools, and provided jobs to those who would never have had the chance to climb out of poverty. To them, he wasn't just a criminal, he was a savior. But the empire that Escobar built wasn't just made of money and cocaine. It was built on a foundation of fear and control. He was the king of Medellin, and anyone who challenged that power would feel the full force of his empire. As he consolidated his hold on the city and beyond, Escobar became more than just a drug lord. He became an unstoppable force, the embodiment of a new kind of power. As Pablo Escobar's success in the cocaine trade grew, so did his ambition. The first big deal had proved his ability to move vast quantities of cocaine across international borders. But Pablo was far from satisfied. He knew that power in this world didn't come from just having money. It came from control, from building an empire that stretched far beyond the borders of Medellin. To do that, he had to expand his network, solidify his alliances, and ensure that no one could threaten his reign. Escobar's expansion began quietly, but quickly picked up speed. Medellin was his base, but he knew that to truly dominate the drug trade, he had to control the entire supply chain. He wasn't just dealing with small-scale shipments anymore. He was planning to flood the United States with cocaine, and to do that, he needed an infrastructure that could support the vast quantities he intended to move. He started securing airstrips, renting warehouses, and establishing contacts in key locations like the Bahamas and Panama, where shipments could be funneled into the U.S. He also ensured that his supply routes were constantly evolving, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement or rival cartels to track his shipments. But even more important than logistics was loyalty. Pablo understood that his empire could only grow if he surrounded himself with people he could trust completely. He needed men who were just as ruthless and calculating as he was, men who would fight for him, work for him, and die for him if necessary. To this end, he recruited his trusted lieutenants, men like Gustavo Gaviria, his cousin, and others who shared his vision and could help him expand his operations. These men weren't just partners. They were the pillars upon which his empire would stand. They handled everything from logistics to security, ensuring that each part of the operation ran smoothly. As his network grew, so did the number of men he controlled. Escobar wasn't just running a drug operation, he was building an army. His lieutenants recruited local enforcers, young men from the barrios of Medellin who were hungry for power and money. They became his sicarios, his hitmen, and his muscle. They weren't just thugs, they were loyal soldiers, and Pablo made sure they understood the rules of the empire. Loyalty was everything. Betrayal was punishable by death. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar had more than just a drug cartel. He had an empire that spanned continents. His Medellin cartel was responsible for the bulk of the cocaine entering the United States, and he controlled not only the supply, but the distribution network. His influence reached into politics, law enforcement, and even the media. Politicians took his bribes, the police turned a blind eye to his operations, and the people of Medellin, for the most part, viewed him as a patron who gave back to the community. He built houses, funded schools, and provided jobs to those who would never have had the chance to climb out of poverty. To them, he wasn't just a criminal, he was a savior. But the empire that Escobar built wasn't just made of money and cocaine. It was built on a foundation of fear and control. He was the king of Medellin, and anyone who challenged that power would feel the full force of his empire. As he consolidated his hold on the city and beyond, Escobar became more than just a drug lord. He became an unstoppable force, the embodiment of a new kind of power. Pablo Escobar's rise to power in Medellin wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a calculated, ruthless climb that demanded more than just ambition. It required vision, strategy, and an unyielding thirst for dominance. By the early 1980s, Escobar had transformed from a small-time smuggler into the undisputed king of the cocaine trade, a man whose name would strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared cross him. Medellin, once a city defined by its struggle and poverty, had become the kingdom of Escobar. He didn't just control the streets, he owned them. Escobar's cartel, with its vast network of operatives and enforcers, was the lifeblood of the city. But his control wasn't limited to the criminal underworld. Over time, Escobar began to infiltrate the very institutions that were meant to stop him. He wasn't just a drug lord. He was a businessman, a politician, and a figure of immense influence. His wealth allowed him to buy loyalty and silence from powerful officials in Colombia's government and law enforcement. If the police came too close, they could be bought. If politicians questioned his rise, they could be intimidated, bribed, or silenced. Escobar understood that in this world, power was a game of chess, one move ahead, always. In Medellin, the people adored him, seeing him as a benefactor, a man who gave back to the community. He funded schools, built homes, and provided jobs to those living in the barrios. The city was struggling with its own violence and poverty, but Escobar was offering an alternative. He wasn't just handing out cash, he was building an empire with a vision of loyalty and protection. To those living in the shadows of Medellin, he was both a savior and a king. And like all kings, he demanded loyalty, absolute, unwavering loyalty. In return, the city gave him its admiration, and the people gave him their fear. His power reached far beyond Medellin, extending to Bogotá and other parts of Colombia. His cartel was bringing in billions, and the Colombian government couldn't ignore the flow of money, even if they didn't fully understand how deeply the roots of the Medellin cartel had spread. He made sure the government knew that any attempt to stop him would be met with consequences. When he wasn't bribing officials, he was creating alliances with rival cartels, ensuring his dominance in the cocaine trade. With every deal made, with every alliance forged, Escobar's grip tightened on Colombia, making it almost impossible for anyone to challenge his empire. But Escobar wasn't just the king of Medellin, he was also a king without a crown. The government, despite accepting his money and his influence, never fully embraced him. He was a necessary evil, the kind of figure whose existence could never be acknowledged publicly, but whose presence was felt everywhere. Still, Escobar reveled in this ambiguity. In the shadows, he was a god, and in the light, he was a king. The people feared him, and the government had to bow to him. It was the perfect paradox, one that would come to define the man and the empire he had built. As Pablo Escobar's empire grew, so did his wealth, expanding at a rate so staggering it seemed almost mythical. His cartel was bringing in billions of dollars, and with every shipment, every new connection, the money poured in faster than he could count it. But for Escobar, wealth was more than just numbers on a balance sheet. It was a tool, a symbol, and a way to build a legacy that would outlive him. He didn't simply want to be rich. He wanted to be untouchable, larger than life. Escobar's lifestyle reflected this insatiable desire for excess. His home in Medellin, known as Hacienda Nápoles, was a palace in every sense of the word. Spread out over thousands of acres, it was a sprawling estate complete with a private zoo, giant statues, and even a runway for his planes. He wasn't satisfied with just a luxurious home. He wanted to create an entire world that symbolized his power and control. The animals he brought in were the most bizarre and expensive hippos, giraffes, ostriches, and more. animals that didn't belong in Colombia, but that he kept like trophies of his success. The hippos, especially, became his trademark. They swam lazily in the lakes of his estate, a bizarre symbol of the man who had built an empire by moving mountains of cocaine. It wasn't just the zoo that reflected his lavish lifestyle. Escobar's wardrobe was filled with high-end suits and shirts, tailored to fit him perfectly. He wore gold chains, fine watches, and expensive jewelry, flaunting his wealth in a way that was impossible to ignore. He didn't just buy things for himself. He bought things for his family, his friends, and his associates. He owned planes, cars, and fleets of trucks, all part of the intricate logistics of his empire, but all carefully chosen to reflect his wealth. He even purchased entire neighborhoods, building homes for the poor to ensure loyalty. But at the same time, he made sure that every home was surrounded by his power. Escobar also began to indulge in more personal luxuries. He bought an island, a private getaway for himself and his inner circle, where he could escape the constant pressure of living in the public eye. The island became a sanctuary, a place to rest and indulge in his whims without fear of being seen. But even in this haven, Escobar couldn't truly escape his own empire. His mind was always on the next shipment, the next move, the next expansion of his cartel. But in between those moments, he reveled in the fruits of his labor. In the streets of Medellin, rumors spread about the lengths to which Escobar would go to flaunt his wealth. Some said he would give away piles of cash to strangers. Others claimed he would throw lavish parties where the best of everything, food, drinks, and entertainment was provided without question. The king of Medellin didn't just live in a palace. He lived like a king, and he wanted the world to know it. His wealth was a display of his dominance, an unspoken declaration that no one could touch him, that no one could take away what he had built. Yet, even as he flaunted his fortune, there was a growing sense that the money would never be enough. For Escobar, wealth wasn't just about luxury. It was about power, about leaving a legacy that would never fade. As Pablo Escobar's empire grew, so did the violence surrounding it. What began as a small operation dealing in cocaine quickly escalated into a brutal war for control, not just of Medellin, but of Colombia itself. Escobar understood that power wasn't simply about money or influence, it was about instilling fear. Fear was the currency that held his empire together, and he used it as a weapon with ruthless precision. In the early days, he relied on intimidation and bribery, but soon, that wasn't enough. He needed terror to solidify his grip, to make every move on the chessboard a reminder that he was not a man to be challenged. The streets of Medellin, once a place of lively commerce and vibrant community, had turned into a battleground. With every increase in Escobar's power came a surge in violence. Rival cartels were one thing, but the Colombian government, the military, and even law enforcement were becoming serious threats to his operations. Escobar, ever the strategist, knew that to remain untouchable, he had to make an example of anyone who dared to oppose him. His tactics grew increasingly brutal, as he made it clear that anyone who stood in his way would not live to see another day. He didn't just target his enemies, he targeted their families, their friends, their entire communities. He made sure that the world understood the price of defying him. In the heart of this violence was the bombing campaign Escobar launched against the Colombian government. He wasn't just assassinating political rivals or police officers. He was creating an environment where fear ruled every corner of the country. The infamous bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, which killed over 100 people, was a prime example of his methods. It wasn't just a move to kill a rival. It was a statement, a brutal reminder to anyone who thought they could stand against him. The bloodshed spread beyond the borders of Medellin, infecting the entire country with violence. The army, police, and even innocent civilians found themselves caught in the crossfire. Escobar didn't care about collateral damage. To him, It was all part of the game. Escobar also began to weaponize his public image. His people didn't just fear him, they revered him. He built schools, funded hospitals, and handed out money to the poor. He became a figure of godlike stature in many of the barrios, where he was seen as a patron saint who protected them from the violence of the government and rival cartels. But underneath this facade was a man who ruled with an iron fist. He surrounded himself with loyal sicarios, young hitmen who had grown up in Medellin's slums, men who saw murder not as a crime but as a means of survival. They were his personal enforcers, his soldiers, and they executed his orders with brutal efficiency. The rise of violence didn't just affect the streets, it infected the entire country's psyche. Colombians lived in constant fear, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. For Escobar, terror became a tool, a way to maintain control over everything and everyone. It was in this climate of fear and bloodshed that he cemented his reign, a reign built not just on cocaine, but on terror that no one could ignore. The streets may have been his kingdom, but the country, his empire, was held hostage by the shadow of violence he cast over it. Pablo Escobar, the kingpin of cocaine, was a master of duality, at once a ruthless murderer, a cunning businessman, and, at least in the eyes of many in Colombia's poorest neighborhoods, a messianic figure. He knew the importance of perception, especially when it came to controlling the people. While he rained terror on his enemies, he also worked tirelessly to secure his place in the hearts and minds of the very communities he ruled over. Escobar had the uncanny ability to portray himself as both a benefactor and a villain, a contradiction that only amplified his influence. Escobar's charitable endeavors were the cornerstone of his public persona. He built schools, hospitals, and housing for the poor of Medellin, creating an infrastructure that many thought the government should have provided. He understood that in a country where the rich and powerful were often out of reach for the destitute, a man who could offer tangible help would earn loyalty in return. The people of the barrios saw Escobar not as a criminal, but as a savior. He funded soccer fields, built neighborhoods, and even offered to pay off the national debt, though some say this was more a gesture for his own political ambitions than true philanthropy. In neighborhoods that had long been neglected by the government, Escobar's generosity stood out like a beacon. The people, many of whom had nothing to their name, adored him. He didn't just throw money at them, he built monuments to his legacy, creating spaces that served as a constant reminder of his power and influence. His gifts weren't just about improving lives, they were about building an image, a mythology. He wanted to be remembered not just as the king of cocaine, but as the king of the people, someone who uplifted the poor while toppling the establishment. But Escobar's generosity was not without its darker undertones. He didn't build these monuments out of kindness alone. They were investments in loyalty. By providing for the people, he made them dependent on him. His wealth, his power, and his influence were embedded in every brick of the schools, every patch of grass on the soccer fields. And in return for these gifts, the people of Medellin remained loyal, either out of gratitude or fear. To them, Escobar wasn't just a drug lord. He was a protector, a man who gave them hope when the rest of the world had abandoned them. His popularity grew as he invested in the community, and he was idolized in the barrios. The term Don Pablo was often whispered in reverence, not just because of his power in the criminal world, but because of the help he provided. Escobar played the role of Robin Hood to perfection, even though his methods were far from noble. He understood that loyalty was the most valuable currency of all. He knew that by building schools and hospitals, he was creating a kingdom that could never be toppled because, in the eyes of the people, he wasn't just a criminal. He was their king. Loyalty was the currency that held Pablo Escobar's empire together, and betrayal was the ultimate sin. In the high-stakes world of cocaine trafficking, where trust was the rarest commodity, Escobar understood the value of having a dedicated inner circle. But loyalty wasn't just expected, it was demanded, and the punishment for treachery was swift, brutal, and without mercy. Escobar's methods for dealing with those who betrayed him were legendary, and they painted a chilling portrait of a man who ruled by fear as much as by force. Within the Medellin cartel, loyalty meant everything. Those who worked for Escobar were often given wealth, protection, and power, but the price was their complete allegiance. Escobar didn't just surround himself with trusted men. He made sure they understood that any hint of betrayal would cost them more than their lives. It would cost them everything. The cartel was a family in the most dangerous sense of the word. He made sure to cultivate loyalty through generosity, but the consequences for crossing him were terrifying. The stories of betrayal within the cartel were often whispered in the shadows, passed down as warnings to those who thought of stepping out of line. One of the most infamous stories was that of a trusted lieutenant who, once a loyal servant of Escobar, was suspected of leaking information to a rival cartel. When Escobar found out, he didn't hesitate. The traitor was executed, his body left in a public place as a grim reminder to anyone who thought they could cross him. For Escobar, punishment was not just about eliminating threats, it was about sending a message. He didn't just kill traitors. He made sure their deaths were witnessed, that the fear it instilled would be felt by anyone in his empire who might consider disloyalty. Escobar's ruthlessness was not reserved for outsiders. Even family members and childhood friends were not spared if they broke his trust. One of his cousins, a man he had grown up with, was suspected of being involved in a plot to undermine him. In a world where loyalty was absolute, such actions were unforgivable. Escobar's response was merciless. The cousin was executed without hesitation, a stark reminder that in his world, blood relations meant little when it came to betrayal. The use of terror became Escobar's signature method for maintaining control. His enforcers, young men known as sicarios, were conditioned to see death as just another part of their job. They carried out executions without question, their loyalty to Escobar stemming from a combination of fear, respect, and the reward of power. A sicario who served Escobar well was guaranteed a life of wealth, but they also knew the price of failure. Escobar's empire was held together not by the strength of his cocaine shipments, but by the unyielding loyalty of those who served him, and by the terror that would follow anyone who dared betray him. His world was one where loyalty meant life, and betrayal meant death. In Escobar's mind, the cost of disloyalty was far greater than the value of any ally or family member. It was the price of his very empire. Pablo Escobar's empire was built not only on the backs of loyal sicarios and business partners, but also on the foundation of his family. Family, in Escobar's world, was everything: his shield, his source of strength, and, in some cases, the hidden hands that enabled his most nefarious activities. But the role of his family wasn't just about support. It was about protection, trust, and sometimes the quiet orchestration of his criminal operations. Escobar was a family man in the truest sense, and his loved ones played a pivotal role in both securing his reign and perpetuating his empire. At the center of Escobar's family was his wife, Maria Victoria Henao. Though she was often sheltered from the horrors of his world, she was his rock, his constant companion, and the mother of his children. To the public, she was the picture of a devoted wife, the perfect balance to Escobar's violent and chaotic life. But behind the scenes, Maria Victoria was more than just a bystander. She helped to keep his world organized, managing aspects of his empire from behind the curtains, often overseeing the day-to-day operations of their many businesses and ensuring that the family remained untouchable by law enforcement. She wasn't just Escobar's wife. She was his partner in maintaining the facade of legitimacy, running everything from the family's finances to the protection of their children. Escobar's children, too, were brought into the fold in ways that may seem unimaginable to most. His son, Juan Pablo, grew up surrounded by luxury, but also by the weight of his father's legacy. Escobar, in many ways, tried to shield his children from the full scope of his criminal activities, wanting to ensure they would inherit a life of wealth and power, not the bloodshed that came with it. But the very fact that they lived in Escobar's world meant they were never truly removed from it. They were constantly under the protection of his vast network of allies, and their lives were as much a part of the empire as any of the business dealings he had with his associates. Escobar's children were his pride, and he intended to groom them for the future, to give them a life untouched by the struggles he had faced as a boy in Medellin. Escobar's extended family, cousins, uncles, and nephews were also integral to his empire. They weren't just family by blood, they were his soldiers, his business partners, and the keepers of his empire. Many of them worked alongside him, overseeing operations in various regions of Colombia. The lines between family loyalty and criminal enterprise blurred completely. It was in these relationships that Escobar's influence spread. He didn't trust just anyone. He trusted his family, because blood, to him, ran thicker than the water of betrayal. But the family bond also had its price. Escobar's world was dangerous, and his family was no exception to the risks that came with it. In moments of crisis, they were just as vulnerable as anyone else. While they protected him from the outside world, they also became the targets of his enemies, the tools used to control his life. In the end, Escobar's family was both his strength and his weakness, a bond that could both shield him and ultimately expose him. Pablo Escobar's ambition was never limited to the world of cocaine. His reach extended far into the political arena, where he sought to carve out a place for himself that was untouchable by law or government. His rise in the criminal underworld had already made him a figure of power, but he soon realized that true control meant gaining influence in the very institutions that could either protect him or bring him down. Escobar understood that money alone wasn't enough. He needed political legitimacy to cement his position as a king, not just of Medellin, but of Colombia itself. In the early 1980s, Escobar entered politics with a calculated move that would blur the lines between criminal empire and government power. He positioned himself as a benefactor to the people, donating to charities, building schools, and sponsoring community projects. His public image was carefully crafted, painting him as a philanthropist, a man who cared for the poor and sought to uplift them. His popularity in the barrios, where he had already earned the loyalty of thousands, gave him the perfect platform to launch his political ambitions. He ran for a seat in Colombia's Congress, successfully winning a position as an alternate member. It was a triumph, not just for Escobar, but for his empire. Through political power, he could shield himself from law enforcement, make deals behind closed doors, and ensure that his criminal activities would be protected by those in positions of power. Escobar's political moves were calculated and brazen. He didn't just want a seat at the table, he wanted to control the table. He bought influence with money and intimidation, forging alliances with corrupt politicians who owed him favors, and giving financial support to those who could advance his interests. His wealth made him a valuable asset to anyone willing to accept his dirty money, and his enemies quickly learned that crossing him could result in death, not just for them, but for their families and supporters as well. However, Escobar's political career was never meant to be a long-term game. His entry into the political sphere was a stepping stone, a way to gain more power and evade the tightening grip of the authorities. The more he rose in the political world, the more threats he faced from the government, which became increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of a drug kingpin sitting in Congress. The media, too, began to take notice, with reports linking him to violence, corruption, and his cartel's growing influence. Escobar's foray into politics ultimately became a double-edged sword. It offered him protection for a time, but it also put him directly in the line of fire from the very people he sought to control. The more he tried to secure his power through politics, the more he exposed himself to those who saw his criminal empire as a threat to the state. In the end, Escobar's political ambitions would only add to the pressure that eventually led to his downfall. As Pablo Escobar's empire grew, so did his enemies. The once collaborative drug trade turned into a battleground, with rival cartels vying for control over the same lucrative territory. Escobar, who had always been ruthless in his rise, became even more relentless in defending his position as the undisputed king of cocaine. The Medellin cartel, under his leadership, clashed with rivals like the Cali cartel, and the consequences were violent, brutal, and far-reaching. The cartel wars weren't fought just with guns. They were fought with terror, strategy, and an unyielding thirst for dominance. Escobar understood that to keep his empire intact, he needed to assert his power over anyone who dared challenge him. He believed in a philosophy of total control, where loyalty and fear went hand in hand. Those who betrayed him met gruesome ends, and his enemies were treated with the same brutality. Assassinations, bombings, and torture became the tools of his trade. Escobar didn't just want to defeat his enemies, he wanted to make an example of them, to send a message that no one was untouchable. The war escalated when the Cali cartel, a more discreet and strategically savvy rival, began to challenge Escobar's dominance. They didn't play by the same rules. They were less flamboyant, more calculating, but just as deadly. The battle for control of Colombia's cocaine distribution routes turned the country into a war zone. The Medellin cartel retaliated with bombings in public spaces, targeting not only cartel members but also civilians, politicians, and anyone who might stand in their way. Escobar, once seen as a patron of the poor, was now a symbol of terror in every corner of Colombia. His ruthlessness knew no bounds, and as the violence escalated, so did the death toll. Escobar's methods were as audacious as they were destructive. He once orchestrated the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, killing 110 people in an attempt to assassinate a presidential candidate who had spoken out against him. In response to growing pressure from the government and rival cartels, Escobar escalated his campaign of terror, ordering hits on judges, journalists, police officers, and even politicians. He targeted anyone who dared to oppose him or threaten his grip on power. The violence wasn't just limited to his enemies. It spread to the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. It was a war with no rules, no morality, and no mercy. But Escobar's belief in violence as the ultimate tool of control was starting to show cracks. His brutal tactics, which had once secured his dominance, were alienating him from the very people who had once supported him. The government, bolstered by American support, began cracking down harder, using military force to hunt down the Medellin cartel. Rival cartels grew bolder, and the public, once enamored with Escobar's image as a benefactor, began to see the cost of his empire in blood and suffering. The cartel wars were Escobar's undoing. His empire, once an unstoppable force, became a target for every law enforcement agency in the world, every rival cartel, and the very people he had once protected. The violence he had used to secure his power was now the thing that would destroy him. As Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire flourished, the Colombian government began to feel the weight of his influence and their inability to control it. Escobar was no longer just a criminal. He had become a national force. His cartel dominated the cocaine trade, and his wealth was so vast that it rivaled that of entire governments. But with power came enemies, and the Colombian government, along with the international community, began to realize that the man who had once been a friend to the poor was now a destructive force, one whose empire threatened the very fabric of the nation. The government's response was swift and decisive. The war on Escobar was no longer a battle against a criminal. It was a battle for the soul of Colombia. As the violence escalated, so did the government's efforts to dismantle his empire. The state, backed by U.S. support, began targeting Escobar's network, going after his lieutenants, his businesses, and his means of transport. The military, once idle in the face of Escobar's power, was now actively engaging with his forces. The government set up special units to hunt down his cartel members, and the search block was created, a task force specifically designed to track Escobar down. But it wasn't just about the guns. It was about the media, the public opinion, and the image of a government unable to stop the kingpin of cocaine. Escobar, however, was no stranger to manipulation. He had always been a master of public perception, and he understood that while the government waged war, the true battle was over the hearts and minds of the people. He fought back in ways that no one could have predicted. He expanded his influence into politics, offering bribes to politicians, paying off judges, and creating allies in the halls of power. His political maneuvering was just as sharp as his business tactics. He sought to secure his place in the system by running for a position in the Colombian Congress, where he used his newly gained legitimacy as a shield. He wasn't just trying to avoid capture, he was trying to embed himself in the very structure of power. This tactic of political manipulation was not just about winning allies, but also about survival. Escobar made it clear that any attempt to bring him down would not just hurt him, it would hurt the people who supported him. His reputation as a benefactor was leveraged to the fullest. The government, now faced with Escobar's considerable sway over the public, struggled to balance the need for justice with the fear of public backlash. He was both a criminal and a political player, operating in the shadows of both worlds. Escobar's responses to government attempts to take him down were calculated. When his political allies were targeted, he fought back with terror. When his money and assets were seized, he retaliated with violence. He used every tool at his disposal to ensure his empire survived, and the Colombian government found itself caught in a vicious cycle. Escobar's empire was too vast to defeat, and his political influence too strong to dismantle without consequences. The battle for power between Escobar and the government wasn't just about cocaine, it was about control of Colombia itself. And as the government stepped up its efforts to eliminate Escobar, he fought back with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him a king. As Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire flourished, the Colombian government began to feel the weight of his influence and their inability to control it. Escobar was no longer just a criminal. He had become a national force. His cartel dominated the cocaine trade, and his wealth was so vast that it rivaled that of entire governments. But with power came enemies, and the Colombian government, along with the international community, began to realize that the man who had once been a friend to the poor was now a destructive force, one whose empire threatened the very fabric of the nation. The government's response was swift and decisive. The war on Escobar was no longer a battle against a criminal. It was a battle for the soul of Colombia. As the violence escalated, so did the government's efforts to dismantle his empire. The state, backed by U.S. support, began targeting Escobar's network, going after his lieutenants, his businesses, and his means of transport. The military, once idle in the face of Escobar's power, was now actively engaging with his forces. The government set up special units to hunt down his cartel members, and the search block was created, a task force specifically designed to track Escobar down. But it wasn't just about the guns. It was about the media, the public opinion, and the image of a government unable to stop the kingpin of cocaine. Escobar, however, was no stranger to manipulation. He had always been a master of public perception, and he understood that while the government waged war, the true battle was over the hearts and minds of the people. He fought back in ways that no one could have predicted. He expanded his influence into politics, offering bribes to politicians, paying off judges, and creating allies in the halls of power. His political maneuvering was just as sharp as his business tactics. He sought to secure his place in the system by running for a position in the Colombian Congress, where he used his newly gained legitimacy as a shield. He wasn't just trying to avoid capture. He was trying to embed himself in the very structure of power. This tactic of political manipulation was not just about winning allies, but also about survival. Escobar made it clear that any attempt to bring him down would not just hurt him, it would hurt the people who supported him. His reputation as a benefactor was leveraged to the fullest. The government, now faced with Escobar's considerable sway over the public, struggled to balance the need for justice with the fear of public backlash. He was both a criminal and a political player, operating in the shadows of both worlds. Escobar's responses to government attempts to take him down were calculated. When his political allies were targeted, he fought back with terror. When his money and assets were seized, he retaliated with violence. He used every tool at his disposal to ensure his empire survived, and the Colombian government found itself caught in a vicious cycle. Escobar's empire was too vast to defeat, and his political influence too strong to dismantle without consequences. The battle for power between Escobar and the government wasn't just about cocaine, it was about control of Colombia itself. And as the government stepped up its efforts to eliminate Escobar, he fought back with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him a king. In the midst of his escalating battles with the Colombian government, Pablo Escobar made a calculated decision that would both shield him from the authorities and solidify his position as a man above the law. The result was La Catedral, a luxurious and fortified prison he had constructed himself. Far from being a typical correctional facility, La Catedral was a symbol of Escobar's power, a place where he could continue his operations while being protected from the very forces trying to take him down. Located high in the mountains, the prison was not only a place of confinement, but a fortress complete with all the amenities of a palace. It had a nightclub, a soccer field, a jacuzzi, and even a bar. Escobar's self-imposed confinement was a far cry from the brutal conditions most prisoners endured. In his case, it was more a retreat than a prison. For Pablo, La Catedral was a strategic move, a means to maintain control over his empire while appearing to comply with the government's demands. His prison was his own design, a place where he could live freely, even in confinement. He remained in charge of his cocaine empire, coordinating deals and making decisions, all while surrounded by loyal men who were more than willing to keep the illusion of captivity intact. Inside, Escobar maintained the same level of dominance he had in the outside world. He received guests, held meetings, and carried on as if he were still in complete control. The prison, in many ways, was an extension of his empire. He was never truly behind bars. The government had given him the illusion of confinement, but Escobar had transformed that illusion into a throne. However, as time went on, the authorities began to realize that La Catedral was less of a prison and more of a playground for Escobar. Rumors of his continued criminal activities from within the walls spread quickly, and the public became aware that he was still running the Medellin cartel as if nothing had changed. His lavish lifestyle and continued control over the cartel did not sit well with the government. They had given Escobar a deal, but he had turned it into a mockery. Tensions mounted as his prison became a symbol of his defiance and unchecked power. The government eventually realized that Escobar's self-built prison was not a solution but a problem. Escobar's time in La Catedral, though luxurious, was not without its challenges. He began to feel the pressure of being trapped in the very structure he had created. He grew restless and paranoid, fearing that the walls around him, no matter how gilded, could never fully protect him from the forces closing in. In the end, the prison became a gilded cage, one from which Escobar would eventually escape. But during his time there, La Catedral was the perfect prison, a place where he continued to rule, even from behind bars. When the Colombian government finally came to the table with a deal for Pablo Escobar, It was as much a testament to their desperation as it was to his unrelenting power. The war against Escobar had consumed the country, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Bombings, assassinations, and political instability were the daily realities of life in Colombia as the government struggled to dismantle Escobar's empire. Faced with mounting pressure, they offered a deal. If Escobar turned himself in, he would serve his sentence in a prison of his own design, a place where he could maintain a level of control while being confined. The government believed that the offer of a luxurious, self-built prison would be enough to pacify Escobar and put an end to the violence. In exchange for his surrender, they agreed to give him a relatively comfortable existence behind bars. For Escobar, the deal was nothing short of a masterstroke. He had always known that true power was not about the amount of money or territory one controlled, but about the ability to manipulate the system to work in one's favor. The agreement gave him exactly what he wanted: a prison built to his specifications, where he could continue to run his cartel and live like a king. He wasn't bound by the same rules as other prisoners. His prison, La Catedral, was more of a fortress, a sanctuary, and a personal playground all rolled into one. It was a bizarre luxury, a strange prison where Escobar could continue to make deals, receive visitors, and even live out some of his former indulgences. From the jacuzzi to the soccer field, the nightclubs to the private rooms, everything in La Catedral spoke of Escobar's defiance of the state. It was not a place of punishment, but a place of refuge, where he could remain in charge and untouchable, all while being shielded from the consequences of his actions. But the deal was not without its risks for the Colombian government. The negotiation, at first, seemed like a concession, but as the months passed, it became clear that Escobar had once again turned the tables. While the authorities believed they had captured a criminal, Escobar saw an opportunity to continue his operations. The government had underestimated his ability to manipulate the system. Despite being behind bars, Escobar maintained his control over his cartel, using La Catedral as a launching pad for his continued operations. The luxury of his prison was not just about comfort, it was about power. He had bargained his way into a position where he was untouchable, running a business empire from the very walls that were supposed to contain him. The strange luxury of La Catedral symbolized the absurdity of the deal. A convicted drug kingpin living out his sentence in a self-designed haven, a far cry from the grim reality of prisons meant for the truly incarcerated. For Escobar, the deal with the devil was not about compromise, it was about control. And in this strange arrangement, he continued to thrive, proving once again that no matter the deal, he would always find a way to come out on top. Pablo Escobar's empire wasn't just built on money and violence, it was sustained by a meticulously crafted network, a web of loyalty, fear, and hidden corners that stretched far beyond the borders of Colombia. It wasn't just a drug cartel, it was a well-oiled machine, one that ran on the sharp instincts of trusted lieutenants, soldiers, smugglers, and politicians alike. Escobar understood early on that true power lay not in controlling a territory, but in controlling the systems that allowed the flow of cocaine, from production to distribution. His empire was vast, sprawling into the jungles, cities, and even international airports, with lines that never crossed, never left a trace. The key to his success was the network of people who served him, those whose loyalty was secured through money, fear, or both. From his most trusted associates, like Gustavo Gaviria, who managed logistics and operations, to the foot soldiers who would die without question for him, Escobar built his empire on connections. His reach extended to every corner of the Colombian underworld and beyond. He owned the police, bribing officers to turn a blind eye or do his bidding. His fingers reached into the military too, where his connections ensured that no raid, no matter how well organized, could dismantle his operations. Politicians, both local and national, were bought, promised positions or cushy deals in exchange for silence or support. Even journalists, who might have been the ones to expose his empire, were under his thumb. A nod from Escobar could turn a whistleblower into a mute bystander. But it wasn't just the men at the top who ensured his dominance. It was the people in the shadows, the ones running the operations, moving product, cleaning money, and managing logistics. Escobar's empire operated like a business, one with layers of employees who often didn't know what anyone else was doing. The production side was an intricate affair, with cocaine being cultivated in hidden laboratories, operated by chemists who lived in constant fear of the cartels, and pilots who risked their lives to transport product in planes that were often too small to carry the weight of their dangerous cargo. His network extended to the streets of New York, Miami, and even further. Handlers and distributors ensured the drugs made it to their final destinations, to the buyers who would pay top dollar. There was an eerie sense of order behind the chaos, a precision to Escobar's operations. No one was ever fully trusted, not even family, and every move was calculated. The network was built not just on people who worked for Escobar, but on the fear they felt. Fear of betrayal, fear of the consequences of crossing him. For each person who left, there were 10 more waiting to fill their shoes. The constant rotation of personnel meant that no one could ever completely escape. Every house had eyes, every corner a potential informant. But despite this, there was an unwavering loyalty to Escobar. To be part of his world meant living without limits, riding the wave of wealth and power. But at what cost? Escobar's empire may have been vast and sophisticated, but it was built on a foundation of ruthless loyalty that could turn deadly at the slightest hint of disobedience. His network was as much a part of the man as the money, and it was this web that allowed Escobar to maintain his hold on an empire that spanned the globe. Pablo Escobar knew the power of image long before the rest of the world caught on. He wasn't just a drug lord, he was a master of public relations. A man who understood that in order to rule a kingdom, you first had to convince people it was theirs to begin with. In Colombia, especially in the poorer barrios, Escobar became a mythical figure, someone whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear, reverence, and, in some places, even love. He wasn't just the king of cocaine, he was Don Pablo, the protector of the people, the man who had their backs when the government wouldn't. He spent millions of dollars on community projects, building schools, housing, and soccer fields. He funded medical clinics and paid for funerals of the poor who couldn't afford it. In the eyes of many, he was more than a criminal. He was a benefactor, a hero, a savior who gave what the state could never offer. Escobar carefully crafted this persona, knowing full well that public opinion could be just as valuable as a gun or a bribe. He made sure to present himself as a Robin Hood figure fighting against an oppressive system, helping the poor, and challenging the authority of the state. He'd throw extravagant parties, give away large sums of money to the poor, and make public gestures that solidified his place as a man of the people. His popularity grew, especially among the lower classes who viewed him as someone who didn't just bring change, but made sure they had a hand in it. But the myth wasn't just built on charity. It was nurtured by fear as much as it was by generosity. People saw Escobar as a protector because, in his world, you either served him or you didn't exist. The other side of his public persona was the one that dealt in violence. He used terror as a tool to maintain control, and those who crossed him paid the price. The myth of Escobar was as complex as the man himself. He was both the hero and the villain, the man who built a kingdom and the one who destroyed it with his ruthless methods. The evolution of the myth surrounding him only grew as his power increased. As the years went on, Escobar's legend expanded beyond Colombia. He wasn't just the kingpin of a global drug trade. He was a symbol, a cautionary tale, and in some ways, a pop culture phenomenon. His story spread through documentaries, films, books, and even t-shirts. People from around the world would visit Medellin to see where the man once ruled, taking photos in front of the places that had witnessed both his rise and his fall. To some, he remained a legend, an untouchable king who lived by his own rules, while to others, he was a cautionary figure whose empire crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. In the end, the myth of Pablo Escobar was not just about the man himself, but about the legacy he left behind. It was the story of how power, violence, and generosity could coexist in a world that had nothing left but chaos. It was a story that continues to echo, long after the man who created it is gone. Pablo Escobar's reign left behind a legacy that still lingers in the streets of Medellin and far beyond. His empire was built on fear, fear of violence, fear of betrayal, and fear of power so immense that even the government dared not confront it head-on for years. He controlled Colombia, not just through wealth but through an unparalleled reign of terror that permeated every level of society. For Escobar, fear wasn't a tool, it was the currency of his empire. He used it to create loyalty, silence his enemies, and maintain control over a nation that had little to offer him except resistance. The stories of his wrath were whispered in hushed voices of bombings that shook the foundations of cities, of assassinations carried out with clinical precision, of men who vanished without a trace. He didn't just kill his enemies, he made them disappear, erasing them as if they'd never existed at all. But it wasn't just the enemies of Escobar who lived in fear. Those closest to him, his lieutenants, his loyal soldiers, they too trembled under his gaze. Loyalty was demanded, but it was never guaranteed. One misstep, one betrayal, and the consequences were swift and brutal. Escobar's methods were not just violent, they were psychological. The fear wasn't just of dying, it was the fear of the unknown, of waking up one morning to find yourself abandoned, discarded, or worse, executed without explanation. Escobar's cartel was a machine of fear, and anyone who worked for him knew the cost of stepping out of line. The price of loyalty wasn't just money, it was the constant threat of death. The impact of Escobar's reign went beyond the borders of Colombia, touching the global landscape in ways that are still felt today. His empire altered the course of the drug trade, making cocaine a household commodity in the United States and carving new, bloody paths for cartels to follow. His actions sent shockwaves through political systems, law enforcement agencies, and families. The Colombian government, weakened by corruption and fear, became paralyzed under the weight of Escobar's power. Foreign governments, especially the United States, found themselves forced into a high-stakes game of diplomacy and force, with the world watching every move. In Medellin, the echoes of his power remain, but so does the trauma. His reign of terror has become ingrained in the collective memory of the people. The murals of Escobar still stand, both a tribute to his myth and a reminder of the bloodshed he left behind. Fear may no longer run the streets as it once did, but its shadow lingers. For those who lived through Escobar's rule, the question isn't whether he was a king or a monster, but whether anyone truly escapes the grip of such a legacy. The fear Escobar instilled was his legacy, and it continues to haunt the people of Colombia, the world, and even the history books. His story isn't just a tale of power and violence, it's a reminder of the depths to which fear can sink and how it can shape not only a kingdom, but the world around it. The fall of Medellin was a slow, agonizing descent into chaos, one that Escobar himself could not escape, no matter how many lives he destroyed or how many mountains of cash he piled up. As his empire expanded, so too did the violence that came with it. Medellin, once a vibrant and growing city, became a battlefield where the echoes of gunfire drowned out the sounds of hope. The streets, once filled with the laughter of children and the hum of daily life, now reverberated with the sounds of explosions, assassinations, and sirens. The heart of the city beat to a rhythm of terror, one that Escobar had set in motion. The toll on Colombian society was immeasurable. In the barrios, the people who had once seen Escobar as a savior now realized they had become pawns in his game, caught between his promises of wealth and his demands for loyalty. For many, the promise of better schools and hospitals came with a price. They were forced to live in the shadow of Escobar's violence, knowing that one wrong move could mean death for them or their families. The streets were no longer safe. People went about their days with a sense of dread, constantly aware that they were living on borrowed time. The drug trade had poisoned not only the country's economy, but its very soul. Escobar's war with the government escalated, turning Medellin into a war zone. The Colombian military, bolstered by U.S. aid, attempted to take back control, but the cost was staggering. Bombings became commonplace, with the city's landmarks reduced to rubble. The Plaza de Toros, once a symbol of Medellin's cultural pride, was transformed into a war zone, and the infamous Carabineros building, home to the nation's law enforcement, was reduced to a smoldering pile of concrete and glass. Lives were lost in droves. Civilians, police, politicians, anyone could become a target in Escobar's twisted game. As Escobar's grip tightened, the city's economy faltered. The violence chased away tourists, foreign investment, and the lifeblood of any thriving city. Opportunity. Jobs became scarce as businesses shut down, unable to function under the constant threat of violence. Medellin, once a hub of industry and culture, was now synonymous with danger, its name spoken with fear in international circles. The fear, once confined to the drug kingpin's enemies, had spread to every corner of the city. Yet, even as the city crumbled under the weight of Escobar's empire, there was a certain kind of resilience in the air. The people of Medellin, while battered, were not broken. In the midst of the violence, small acts of defiance emerged. People continued to live, to love, to fight for a future that seemed increasingly out of reach. But the shadow of Escobar remained, hanging over the city, a constant reminder of the price paid for the false promises of power and wealth. The fall of Medellin was inevitable. Its rise was only possible once the echoes of violence faded, and the city began to rebuild, piece by piece, from the ashes of a war that Escobar had waged on them all. As the years went on, the weight of Escobar's empire began to take its toll, not just on Colombia, but on him personally. The lavish lifestyle, once a symbol of his invincibility, now became a cage, each piece of gold, and every new mansion a reminder that nothing in his world was truly safe. Escobar's paranoia grew with every passing day, feeding off the enemies he had made, the betrayals he had orchestrated, and the looming threat of a government that would stop at nothing to bring him down. The walls, once invisible and far away, now seemed to close in tighter with each victory he claimed, each deal he brokered, and each person he trusted. At first, it was subtle. A glance over his shoulder, a tightness in his chest whenever a phone call rang too long, the strange feeling that someone might be watching him from across the street. But as time passed, it became consuming. Escobar, the man who once moved freely through the streets of Medellin, now found himself hiding behind layers of security. His old friends became suspects, and his closest allies, potential betrayers. He no longer slept soundly in any one place, rotating through safe houses like an animal on the run, always just one step ahead of the inevitable. It wasn't just the government or rival cartels that he feared now. It was everyone. His family, once his anchor, now seemed like a vulnerability. His wife, Maria Victoria, and their children were moved from one safe house to another, always under the watchful eye of bodyguards, but never out of the reach of the uncertainty Escobar felt creeping in. He no longer trusted the people he once called his men, the guards who had once sworn loyalty to him, the lieutenants who had helped him build his empire, were now seen as liabilities. Each handshake became a potential lie, each word spoken a possible betrayal. The people around him sensed the change. Where once there was laughter and easy camaraderie, there was now tension and silence. Even his most loyal men, those who had fought beside him through the blood and the fire, began to feel the strain. The paranoia that Escobar had once used to control others was now controlling him. Every move he made was calculated, every step taken with caution, as if the world was waiting for him to slip up. He started to isolate himself further, locking himself away in his fortress-like homes, only allowing the most trusted into his inner circle. His empire, once the epitome of power and control, became a series of silos, each part working in isolation, with Escobar pulling the strings from behind closed doors. Even the simple pleasures he had once enjoyed, flying in his planes, hosting lavish parties, lost their appeal. What good was all the power in the world if he couldn't trust anyone around him? What good was wealth when sleep was no longer a refuge, but a reminder of all that could go wrong? Escobar, the king who had once ruled with an iron fist, was now a man living in the shadow of his own mind. The paranoia, once a tool for survival, had become his prison, and in that prison, no one could hear him scream. Pablo Escobar's last days on the run were marked by a sense of desperation and inevitability, as though the very walls he had built over the years were finally closing in. La Catedral, his self-built prison, was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he could rule from within, untouched by the world outside. But the luxury he had once enjoyed there quickly became a gilded cage, as whispers of betrayal and government pressure seeped through the walls. Escobar, ever the tactician, saw the writing on the wall. His time there was running out. The Colombian government had made its move, no longer willing to tolerate his reign from within a prison he controlled. His once unshakable confidence began to crumble as the noose tightened, and on July 22, 1992, Escobar did the unthinkable. With the help of a few loyal allies and his mind as sharp as ever, he escaped through a tunnel he had prepared months in advance, slipping away like a shadow in the night. The escape, calculated and seamless, was a testament to Escobar's resourcefulness and the years of planning that had become second nature to him. But in the aftermath, the myth of his invincibility was starting to falter. The king of cocaine was now a fugitive once again, this time more vulnerable than ever. Escobar's new life on the run was nothing like the opulent existence he had built for himself. Gone were the days of private jets, lavish parties, and expensive cars. Instead, he was now reduced to hiding in the most humble of places, abandoned houses, remote farms, and safe houses that constantly shifted like the sands beneath his feet. His empire, once vast and untouchable, was now shrinking, each day a reminder that the world he had created was slipping from his grasp. For the first time, Escobar, the king who had once walked the streets of Medellin like a god, found himself relying on the same secrecy and fear that had once worked for him. Trust became an even more valuable commodity. His bodyguards, once part of a tight-knit group of loyal men, were now questioned and rotated constantly. He no longer relied on lavish luxuries or the people who had once served him without question. Instead, it was the people who would betray him that became the biggest threat. Every phone call was a risk. Every movement was under scrutiny, and even his family was not safe from the dangers that surrounded him. But even in his final days, Escobar's legend only grew. He was no longer just a drug lord. He was a ghost, a shadow haunting the country he once ruled. The man who had built an empire of fear, wealth, and blood was now reduced to a fugitive, constantly running, never knowing where he would find his next safe haven. The world, once held in his grip, now seemed so distant, so unreachable, and yet his name still carried weight. His presence still loomed large in the minds of his enemies and his supporters alike. Escobar was a man on the run, but he was also a a legend that would never truly disappear, no matter how far he ran. The manhunt for Pablo Escobar began the moment he slipped through the walls of La Catedral, igniting a pursuit that would stretch across the globe. The Colombian government, once too weak to stand against his empire, now had no choice but to act. Escobar's escape had shaken the country to its core, and the public outcry for justice was deafening. The streets of Medellin buzzed with rumors of his whereabouts, but no one could be sure. He was a ghost, a figure that loomed larger than life even in his disappearance. The government's response was swift, but it was no longer just a national affair. The United States, which had long considered Escobar a threat to global security, became an eager partner in the effort to track him down. The DEA, the CIA, and a special task force known as the Search Bloc were deployed. Their orders simple: capture or kill the most wanted man in the world. The combined forces of Colombia and the U.S. were determined to bring Escobar to justice. They utilized every resource at their disposal: satellites, wiretaps, and informants to track his movements. The quiet, rural farms and humble safehouses where Escobar once sought refuge became his prisons as he moved from place to place, always one step ahead of the men trying to find him. The Search Bloc scoured the jagged mountains and dense jungles of Colombia, certain that the kingpin of the Medellin cartel could not escape their grasp for long. Yet Escobar's ability to blend into the landscape was a skill honed over decades. The man who had built a network of fear, bribery, and manipulation now used that same web of contacts to disappear into the shadows, his escape routes as intricate as his rise to power had been. At the same time, rival cartels, some of whom had been enemies during Escobar's reign, began to join the hunt. The Cali cartel, who had once been driven to the brink of destruction by Escobar's aggression, now saw an opportunity. They knew that capturing or killing Escobar could solidify their dominance in the drug trade once and for all, but their involvement came with its own dangers. Escobar's reach, even in hiding, was vast, and his loyalists were ready to fight to the death. For the first time, the very men who had once served him were now turning against him, offering information to authorities, fueled by a mix of greed and revenge. Some whispered of his escape, others of his location, and in the murky world of betrayal, even loyalty became a currency. As the search tightened, Escobar's paranoia grew, a constant companion that haunted him even in his most isolated moments. Every rustling leaf, every car passing by was a reminder that the world he had built was now crumbling around him. The hunt for Pablo Escobar was no longer just a matter of government or rival cartels. It had become an obsession, and it seemed that no matter how far he ran, the noose was slowly but surely closing in. After Pablo Escobar's daring escape from La Catedral, the foundation of his empire began to crumble, piece by piece. The once unbreakable Medellin cartel, which had dominated the global cocaine trade for years, found itself weakened, fractured, and vulnerable. Without Escobar at the helm, the intricate web of power that had kept his operations running smoothly began to unravel. His absence created a power vacuum in the cocaine trade, one that his enemies and former allies alike rushed to fill. Rival cartels, like the Cali cartel, seized the opportunity to expand their reach, positioning themselves as the new kings of the drug trade. Escobar's loyalists, once the backbone of his operations, now found themselves scattered and uncertain. The men who had served him with unwavering dedication were now faced with a brutal reality. Their leader was gone, and they were left to fend for themselves. The cartel's structure, built on fear, loyalty, and violence, began to collapse as internal divisions and betrayals grew. Former lieutenants and trusted aides turned on one another, driven by the desire for power and the need to survive. The once tight network of smugglers, assassins, and accountants was now splintered, and the cohesiveness that Escobar had forged over years of ruthless leadership evaporated. The vacuum left by Escobar's disappearance didn't just affect his loyalists, it rattled the entire infrastructure of the cocaine trade. With his arrest or death looming on the horizon, there was no longer a single, unifying figure capable of keeping the cartel together. The once flourishing business of transporting massive amounts of cocaine to the United States and Europe became chaotic. The intricate smuggling routes Escobar had meticulously designed became unreliable, as rival factions sought control of different territories and distribution channels. The shipments that had once flowed smoothly were now marred by disputes and infighting. Meanwhile, the Colombian government, emboldened by Escobar's escape, escalated its efforts to dismantle the cartel once and for all. The government was no longer fighting a single entity, but a fractured group of criminals with competing interests. Law enforcement and military forces began to target not just the cartel's operatives, but the very infrastructure that had sustained it: warehouses, landing strips, and safe houses. But even as the pressure mounted, Escobar's influence continued to linger in the shadows. His legend, the fear he instilled, and the loyalty he had built among his people made it difficult to fully sever the grip he had on Medellin and beyond. The disintegration of Escobar's empire was not just the fall of a drug lord, it was the collapse of a carefully crafted network that had reshaped Colombia's drug trade. With every passing day, the once glorious Medellin cartel slipped further into chaos, losing its grip on the lucrative cocaine business. The world that Escobar had built with such precision was now a shattered reflection of its former self, and the consequences of his absence would echo through the streets of Medellin for years to come. In the wake of Pablo Escobar's escape, a new force emerged from the shadows, intent on erasing the remnants of his empire. Los Pepes, a vigilante group composed of former allies, rival criminals, and victims of Escobar's brutality, began a campaign of revenge that would escalate the already violent conflict to new heights. Their name, which stood for Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, embodied their singular goal: to dismantle Escobar's empire and avenge the lives lost in his wake. What started as an underground movement quickly morphed into a ruthless, organized group driven by a shared hatred for the man who had terrorized Colombia for years. Los Pepes had the backing of both Colombian authorities and rival cartels, most notably the Cali cartel, who were keen to see Escobar's downfall. With their resources and connections, Los Pepes became a shadowy presence that operated outside the law, engaging in brutal acts of retribution. They took the fight directly to Escobar's closest associates, targeting his family members, business partners, and loyalists. Escobar's former henchmen, once untouchable, found themselves hunted down by the very people they had once trusted. Los Pepes weren't just seeking retribution, they were sending a clear message. They were erasing the legacy of the man who had once controlled them all. The war between Los Pepes and Escobar's associates was vicious and unforgiving. What had once been a well-oiled machine of corruption and violence under Escobar's reign now descended into a chaotic bloodbath. Escobar's loyalists, who had once benefited from his protection, were now forced to navigate a battlefield filled with the ghosts of their past. Many went into hiding, but even then, there was no true safety. Los Pepes were relentless, infiltrating neighborhoods, tapping into old networks, and using every means at their disposal to root out the last remnants of Escobar's empire. The tactics employed by Los Pepes were both psychological and physical, designed to instill terror and break the spirit of those still loyal to Escobar. They didn't hesitate to use extreme violence. Bombings, kidnappings, and executions became their signature. No one was safe. Not even the innocents who had once been in Escobar's favor were spared. Los Pepes were as feared as Escobar himself had once been, but they operated with a cold, calculated cruelty. They weren't just avenging personal loss, they were aiming to erase Escobar's influence from the country entirely. As the war escalated, the Colombian government, while supportive of Los Pepes' actions, was forced to confront the moral consequences of allowing a vigilante group to operate with such unchecked power. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, one thing was certain: Escobar's downfall was now being fueled, not just by law enforcement, but by the very ghosts of his past, the ghosts that he had once created. As the walls of Pablo Escobar's empire crumbled, the ultimate betrayal came not from the authorities or rival cartels, but from within his own ranks. Those he had once trusted, the men who had helped him build his cartel into the most powerful drug organization in the world, began to turn on him. In the chaos that followed his escape, the very people who had profited from his vision and brutality started to see him not as a king, but as a liability. The once impenetrable loyalty that Escobar had cultivated among his lieutenants and associates began to dissolve as swiftly as the empire he had built. The turning point came slowly. As Escobar's former allies saw the writing on the wall, the end of his reign, some chose to align themselves with the government, the Cali cartel, or even Los Pepes, the very group that had once been his enemies. They began to feed information, sometimes willingly, sometimes out of fear, to those who were hunting him. Others, unable to bear the mounting pressure, started to distance themselves, quietly severing ties with the man who had once been their protector. The loyalty that had defined Escobar's empire now evaporated like smoke in the wind. Escobar, a man who had once commanded loyalty and admiration, was now a figure isolated in the shadows. The trust he had once placed in his network was shattered, and he found himself in a world where even the closest of his men could not be relied upon. His own security was compromised as former allies, once family, turned on him. The betrayal was not just tactical, but personal. Each act of treason cut deeper into Escobar's psyche, unraveling the very fabric of his existence. The king who had ruled Medellin with fear now found himself consumed by it. In his final days, Escobar was a man haunted, not just by his enemies but by the ghosts of his past. The phone calls from his family became fewer, and the conversations, once filled with bravado and confidence, now carried an undertone of desperation. His once unshakable aura of invincibility had cracked, leaving behind a man who had nowhere to turn. His world had narrowed to a series of safe houses, cramped hideouts, and fleeting moments of hope that were crushed almost as quickly as they came. His paranoia grew, as did his sense of loneliness. He slept less, always with one eye open, knowing that even his closest men might be the ones to turn him in. He had built an empire of fear, but now he was its prisoner. Every new face, every unfamiliar sound, became a threat. There were no more victories, only the quiet resignation that his time was running out. The man who had once ruled with iron fists was now powerless, surrounded by nothing but the emptiness of betrayal. His final days were marked not by the sound of gunfire or explosions, but by the deafening silence of a man who had lost everything and everyone. The weight of Pablo Escobar's empire began to take its toll long before his eventual fall. The power he had so carefully cultivated, the networks he had built through violence and manipulation, came at a personal cost he could no longer ignore. Beneath the bravado, beneath the outward appearance of the king who controlled everything in his path, was a man unraveling. Escobar's health deteriorated as the years of stress, violence, and paranoia caught up with him. The sleepless nights, the constant movement, the fear of betrayal, all of it chipped away at his physical strength. His body, once strong and imposing, grew frail and worn. His once perfectly manicured image as a powerful drug lord began to crack as the years of pressure bore down on him. Mentally, Escobar was no longer the calculating strategist who had risen from the slums of Medellin. The constant danger he faced, The need to outsmart not just the authorities but those closest to him took a devastating toll on his mind. Paranoia became his constant companion, a voice in his head that never quieted. He could no longer trust anyone, not even the men who had been with him since the beginning. The fear of betrayal became a consuming obsession. The people who had once supported him, those who had fought with him in the trenches, were now seen as potential threats. Every conversation, every glance, was loaded with suspicion. He had built a kingdom out of fear, but that same fear was now eating him alive from the inside. Escobar's family was no exception to the toll that his empire took. His wife, Maria Victoria, and their children lived in constant fear, constantly moving, hiding from the dangers that surrounded them. What had once been a family united by love and ambition was now fractured by the very thing that had brought them wealth and power. Maria Victoria, the woman who had stood by him through it all, could no longer see the man she had once loved, only the shell of the man who had become a prisoner of his own creation. The children, growing up in the shadows of their father's empire, were isolated from the world, their innocence lost to the bloodstains of their father's past. As Escobar's health worsened, his mental state became more fragile. The man who had once reveled in his ability to control everything, to bend people to his will, now found himself unable to control the one thing that mattered most, his own fate. His empire, which had once seemed unshakable, was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The toll of power had taken everything from him, leaving him a broken man, unable to escape the ghosts of his past or the enemies who had once been his allies. The king who had once ruled from the rooftops, who had walked through the barrios as a hero, now walked in silence, haunted by the very legacy he had built. In the final days of his life, Pablo Escobar sought refuge in the very place that had once given him the strength to rise, the jungle. The vast, untamed land had been his sanctuary in the early days of his empire, offering a place to hide from the authorities, a place where he could move freely, far from the prying eyes of the world. But as his empire crumbled and his enemies closed in, the jungle had become a paradox, both a symbol of his past power and a constant reminder of the man he had become. It was a refuge he knew well, yet it now held a darker meaning, one tied to the isolation he had imposed upon himself. Escobar's efforts to return to the jungle were a desperate attempt to find safety, a final search for peace in a place that had once shielded him from the chaos he had created. He retreated into the dense forests of Colombia, hoping the familiar terrain would offer him the protection he could no longer find in the cities or in the arms of his allies. He believed that by returning to his roots, he could reclaim control, that the land he had once conquered could somehow give him the power he had lost. But the jungle, now thick with the ghosts of his past, offered him no solace. The sense of invincibility he had once felt in its depths had vanished, replaced by a suffocating dread. The jungle, which had once been a symbol of his untamed power, now served as a place of exile. Escobar moved through its dense undergrowth, always on edge, as if the trees themselves were closing in on him. The sounds of the forest, once comforting and familiar, now felt like warnings. Each rustling leaf, each bird call, seemed to echo with the weight of his downfall. He could no longer hide in the shadows as he once had. Every crack in the underbrush, every shift in the wind, was a reminder that his enemies were always watching, waiting for the moment to strike. In his isolation, Escobar clung to the remnants of his past, hoping that by returning to the jungle, he could find a way out of the tangled mess of his life. But the jungle had become a prison of its own, an inescapable web woven by the choices he had made. The people who had once followed him, who had seen him as a leader and protector, had long since turned away. The trust that had bound them together had crumbled, and now Escobar found himself alone, surrounded by the very elements that had once been his allies. The call of the jungle, once a powerful force drawing him back to his origins, had become a haunting reminder of all he had lost. The safety he sought there was no longer attainable, and the jungle, with all its beauty and danger, only deepened his sense of entrapment. The man who had once controlled an empire with a mere thought now wandered through the wilderness, a ghost of his former self. Pablo Escobar, the king of Medellin, was a man who could not rest. As his empire crumbled and his enemies closed in, sleep became a distant memory, an elusive luxury that he could no longer afford. The weight of his actions, the countless betrayals, and the ever-present danger gnawed at his mind, turning the once powerful figure into a shadow of his former self. Sleep, which had once come easily during his rise, was now replaced by an incessant need to remain vigilant. He knew that the second he closed his eyes, the world could shift, his enemies could strike, and his empire could fall from beneath him. The toll on his mind was evident in the hollow look in his eyes, the twitch in his hand as he reached for a weapon that was no longer a tool of control, but a crutch to support a trembling confidence. His paranoia deepened with each passing day, and with it, his obsession with safety. He moved through the world like a man constantly in motion, never staying in one place for too long, never allowing himself to grow too comfortable. Every building, every corner, every street was a potential threat. The guards who once surrounded him were now a lifeline, but even their presence offered no real protection from the demons that haunted him. His nights were filled with restless pacing, his mind running wild with thoughts of escape, of survival, of the constant fear that had become his only companion. His safe houses were a maze of traps and escape routes, designed to offer him protection from his enemies, but in truth, they were nothing more than walls closing in on him. He trusted no one, not even his closest allies. The whispers of betrayal were always in the air, and even in the quietest moments, the sound of footsteps in the hallway sent a chill through his bones. Escobar's obsession with safety reached a point where it consumed him entirely. Every conversation was filtered through layers of suspicion, every handshake measured for signs of disloyalty. The once fearless leader had become a man terrified of losing control, of being caught in a world that had outgrown him. He could no longer sleep, not because of the constant physical threat, but because the very idea of sleep represented vulnerability. To sleep was to surrender, and to surrender meant that everything he had built could vanish in an instant. His mental decline was marked by moments of reflection, fleeting glimpses of the man he used to be. The man who had once commanded respect and fear now found himself questioning everything. He would stare into the mirror, searching for a trace of the strength that had once been his. But all he saw was a man who had lost everything: his peace, his family, his empire. Escobar had built a kingdom on fear, but in the end, it was fear that destroyed him, piece by piece. The man who had once controlled the streets of Medellin could no longer control his own mind. The hunt for Pablo Escobar had reached its final stage, and the walls were closing in around him. The Colombian government, backed by U.S. intelligence, had intensified their search, employing the latest technology and deploying teams of officers determined to bring him to justice. Every day, they grew closer. The same man who had once controlled Medellin with absolute authority was now a fugitive, desperate, and alone, clinging to the remnants of his once mighty empire. The days had blurred together, each one passing with a sense of inevitability, the end drawing nearer with every step. Escobar's movements had become increasingly erratic, as his paranoia continued to spiral. He had spent so many months hiding in the shadows, moving from one safe house to another, that the once unshakable king of cocaine now found himself worn down by the constant fear, the sleepless nights, and the weight of betrayal from every corner. The people who had once surrounded him had either vanished or turned their backs, leaving him with only a handful of loyal followers who were equally trapped in the same unrelenting game of survival. His mental state was deteriorating, and every step he took was one step closer to a fate he could no longer outrun. The pressure of being the most wanted man in the world was overwhelming. It wasn't just the Colombian authorities closing in, it was the ghosts of his past, the men he had wronged, the allies who had turned into enemies. The constant sense of being hunted had taken its toll. There was no safe place left. Escobar, who had once thought himself invincible, now found himself on the run, isolated from the world he had once ruled with fear and intimidation. The thrill of power had given way to a haunting emptiness, the realization that nothing could stop the inevitable. For the first time in his life, Escobar could no longer control the situation. The man who had built his empire through calculated violence and cunning manipulation was now caught in a trap of his own making. The network he had created, which had once felt unbreakable, was now disintegrating, with rivals like Los Pepes closing in and his own cartel splintering under the pressure. His world, once so carefully constructed, was falling apart piece by piece. There was nowhere left to hide, no one left to trust. The hunt had become personal, and as much as Escobar tried to outrun it, he knew deep down that his time was running out. Every step he took in those final days was filled with the crushing weight of inevitability. There was no longer any escape. The chase that had begun years ago had finally caught up with him, and the man who had once ruled a nation was now reduced to a hunted fugitive, trapped in a web of his own making. The end was near, and for Pablo Escobar, there was no more room to run. The final moments of Pablo Escobar's life unfolded in a manner befitting the legend he had become. It was a quiet afternoon in Medellin, the city he had once controlled with an iron fist, now a place where his name struck fear into the hearts of many. He had long since stopped being the man who ruled from the shadows. His empire, once sprawling and powerful, was now crumbling around him, piece by piece. As the walls closed in, Escobar found himself in a small, unassuming house, hiding in plain sight like a man out of time, trying to hold on to something, anything, that resembled control. The search for him had reached its apex. His every movement was being tracked, and the final days had become a waiting game, with the government and rival cartels closing in from every side. Escobar, now a shell of the ruthless figure he had once been, could not stop the inevitable. The hunt had caught up to him. He had no more plans, no more places to hide. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable confrontation. It was on that rooftop, the one he knew so well, where his final stand occurred. Escobar had always trusted the rooftops of Medellin. They had been his escape routes in the past, places where he could disappear into the city's labyrinth of alleys and rooftops, a master of evasion. But now, with his back to the wall and his enemies closing in, the rooftop became his final battleground. There was no more running, no more negotiating, only one last, desperate attempt to escape the inevitable. As the Colombian search block moved in, Escobar, armed with only a pistol, made his way to the roof. His bodyguard, El Lemon, was with him, but there was little they could do now. The world had caught up to them. Escobar fired the first shots, but they were not the calculated, cold shots of the king of the underworld. They were desperate, hurried, a man trying to outrun his fate. His aim was off, his hands shaky. The years of power, fear, and violence had taken their toll. The Colombian officers returned fire, and Escobar's time was up. A bullet struck him in the leg, sending him stumbling, and as he tried to escape, another shot caught him in the back. The final bullet, the one that would end his reign, struck behind his ear, and the man who had once terrified entire nations crumpled to the ground, his body finally succumbing to the weight of his own choices. The rooftop grew silent. The man who had once orchestrated chaos from his high-rise offices was now just another lifeless body on the streets of Medellin. His legacy, his empire, everything he had fought for had come to an end. The search block moved in, securing the area, and the world exhaled. Escobar was dead, But the myth of Pablo Escobar would live on, forever etched in the history of Colombia and the world. The news of Pablo Escobar's death spread like wildfire, a sudden and shocking event that seemed to reverberate across the globe. For years, he had been the most wanted man in the world, a figure whose very name was synonymous with violence, power, and fear. His death, though anticipated, marked the end of an era for Colombia and the world. It was as if a shadow had been lifted, but in its place, a more unsettling quiet emerged. The immediate aftermath of Escobar's death was a strange blend of relief and tension. The Colombian government, which had spent years in a bloody and costly war with Escobar, released statements claiming victory. They called it the end of the drug kingpin's reign, the destruction of his empire, and a moment of justice for the people of Colombia. But even as officials spoke, there was no celebration. The streets of Medellin were eerily quiet, and those who lived in the barrios he once controlled seemed unsure how to respond. Some felt a profound sense of relief. For many, Escobar had been both a hero and a villain, a figure whose presence had shaped their lives in ways both positive and terrifying. He had built schools, provided jobs, and funded local communities. But he had also left a trail of destruction that had forever altered the fabric of Colombian society. With his death, it was as if the chapter of violence had finally closed, but the scars were still visible, especially in the communities he had once ruled. In the poorer parts of Medellin, people gathered in small groups, whispering about the man who had once promised to bring them hope, only to leave them with shattered lives. The government, too, felt a complex mix of emotions. While there was an official narrative of triumph, the reality was far more complicated. Escobar's death did not wipe away the problems that had been born out of his empire. The drug trade continued, though it was no longer centered on one man. His associates, former allies, and rivals still controlled the routes, still moved the product, and still had the power to wreak havoc. The true impact of Escobar's death was not in the end of an empire, but in the realization that power was not easily replaced, nor could it be eradicated overnight. The international reaction was similarly mixed. For some, it was a moment of justice served, a symbolic victory in the ongoing war against drugs. For others, it was the death of a man who had become larger than life, whose story had been told and retold until he had transcended his crimes. Escobar had become a myth, a living legend, and with his death, his legacy seemed to grow even more powerful. Documentaries, books, and movies soon followed, casting him as the anti-hero of a dark and dangerous world. Escobar's death, though definitive in its finality, was not the death of the myth he had built. It was merely the beginning of the legend's second life, one that would be told for generations to come. The death of Pablo Escobar marked a significant turning point for Colombia, but it did not signal the end of his influence. His empire, built on the foundations of violence, fear, and unimaginable wealth, continued to echo through the country long after his death. The power vacuum left in the wake of his absence was quickly filled by other cartels. But Escobar's legacy remained a force that shaped the country in ways that could not easily be undone. In the immediate aftermath of his death, there was a collective sigh of relief. The Colombian government, backed by the international community, celebrated what they believed to be a victory in the war on drugs. Yet, beneath this surface of triumph, a darker reality persisted. The systems that Escobar had created, the networks, the alliances, and the methods had not disappeared with him. The Medellin cartel may have crumbled, but other cartels rose in its place, many of them learning from Escobar's strategies and mistakes. His influence lingered, like an unshakable shadow, over the entire drug trade. The Colombian streets that had once buzzed with Escobar's presence now seemed to be under the influence of his old lieutenants and new players alike. The routes that had once been controlled by Escobar were still being used, and the drug business continued to thrive. His legacy was not in the money he left behind, but in the methods of operation, the corruption, and the violent landscape he had cultivated. The networks of power and influence he had set up were now more diffuse, more fragmented, but just as deadly. Escobar's reign had been about more than just drugs. It had been about control. His empire had extended beyond the borders of Colombia, with tentacles reaching into the United States, Europe, and beyond. Even after his death, the business of cocaine continued to flourish. The trade evolved, with new players adopting the same ruthless tactics that had made Escobar a household name. His methods, his thirst for dominance, and his capacity for violence were passed on to others who saw what he had achieved and sought to emulate it. For Colombia, the memory of Escobar remained ingrained in the national consciousness. His rise, his reign, and his brutal fall left scars that would not heal quickly. In Medellin, the city where Escobar had made his mark, people continued to wrestle with the contradictions of his legacy. Some still remembered him as a benefactor, a man who had provided for the poor and built schools and hospitals. Others saw him as a terrorist, a killer, and a symbol of everything that was wrong with the nation. Escobar's death did not silence the echoes of his empire. Instead, it ensured that his story would continue to be told, debated, and mythologized for years to come. His impact on Colombia was too deep, too ingrained, for it to disappear simply because he was gone. The country moved forward, but Escobar's shadow remained, lingering in the corridors of power, in the whispers of the people, and in the very fabric of Colombian society. After Pablo Escobar's death, his family found themselves trapped in a complex web of emotions and circumstances that no one could have predicted. The man who had once ruled with absolute power, who had forged an empire based on violence and fear, was gone. Yet, the shadow of his crimes loomed over every aspect of their lives, and for his family, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be filled with questions, guilt, and a search for peace that would never come easily. Maria Victoria Henao, Escobar's wife, was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been built on blood and money. She had lived through the years of power and fear, standing by him while he built his empire. But she had also witnessed the growing paranoia, the betrayals, and the violence that came with it. In the aftermath of his death, she was left alone to face the world that had once revered and feared her husband. She was thrust into the public eye, with the weight of Escobar's legacy following her every move. The media scrutinized her, questioned her loyalty, and treated her as guilty by association. She was forced to go into hiding with her children, trying to rebuild a life far from the chaos Escobar had created. For Escobar's children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, their lives were shattered. As young children, they had been sheltered from the worst of their father's criminal activities. Yet, after his death, they were forced to confront the reality of who their father had been and what he had done. Their names were forever linked to his notorious legacy, and no matter where they went, they were constantly reminded of the violence and the wealth that had marked their family's history. Juan Pablo, later changing his name to Sebastián Marroquín, took the most public stance against his father's actions. He became an advocate for peace, giving interviews and writing a memoir where he condemned his father's criminal empire. He was determined to break free from the past and create a new identity for himself, one that wasn't defined by the man who had been both a killer and a provider. But despite their efforts to distance themselves from Escobar's legacy, the family could never fully escape it. The sins of the father had stained their lives in ways that time would not heal. They were caught in the crossfire of public opinion, torn between the love they had for their father and the atrocities he had committed. Their lives were filled with constant upheaval, from forced relocations to hiding from the media and even death threats. They could never truly find peace because they were always running from their past. The family's legacy became a burden they could never shake, a constant reminder of the man they had loved, but who had caused so much pain. They were left to grapple with the consequences of Escobar's actions, trying to find redemption in a world that could never forgive the bloodshed he had left behind. In the end, the Escobar family's journey was not one of fame or wealth, but of survival, a struggle to find a way to live in the shadows of a man who had left behind an empire that would haunt them forever. Pablo Escobar's death was not just a singular event. It was the climax of a story that had played out in the streets of Medellin for decades. And yet, even in death, Escobar's legacy remained as complex and turbulent as ever. His burial, much like his life, was surrounded by secrecy and uncertainty. The Colombian government, eager to close the chapter on the man who had ruled their country with terror, moved swiftly to claim his body. They wanted to bury him in an unmarked grave, far from the prying eyes of the public, hoping to erase him from history. But even in death, Escobar refused to be forgotten. The funeral was a stark contrast to the elaborate displays of wealth and power Escobar had once enjoyed. There were no grand processions, no show of opulence, no floral tributes or speeches. The man who had once spent millions on his personal comforts was now buried in a simple grave. His funeral was modest, a small gathering of family and close associates. Yet, as with everything Escobar had touched, there was an eerie tension. The man who had inspired both fear and admiration was gone, but the air still felt thick with his presence. Despite the government's efforts to keep the funeral low-key, news of his death spread quickly through Medellin. Some came to mourn, but many more came to witness the end of the legend. The streets filled with people, their faces uncertain. Were they grieving the loss of a man who had given them so much, or were they relieved that the terror had finally ended? Some brought flowers to the grave, while others threw stones or spat on the ground. No one could deny that Escobar had been a force of nature, shaping the city and the lives of its people in ways that would last long after his death. The contradictions of his life were mirrored in the public's reaction. To some, he was a patron, a provider for the poor. To others, he was a monster who had brought untold destruction to Colombia. His final resting place, though unmarked, became a site of pilgrimage. People would visit, some to honor the man they still called the King, others to spit on his memory. The absence of closure was palpable. There was no final acknowledgement of his crimes, no apology or redemption. Escobar's death had brought an end to one chapter, but it had left an open wound. The country, and especially Medellin, was left grappling with the aftermath of his rule. His burial, or rather the lack of ceremony around it, seemed to symbolize the fractured nature of Escobar's legacy. The man who had ruled an empire had been buried with little fanfare, but his myth was far from dead. His story continued to haunt Colombia, leaving a lingering presence that no grave could ever contain. After Pablo Escobar's death, Colombia was left to pick up the pieces of a nation that had been torn apart by his reign of terror. The immediate relief was palpable. The air in Medellin, once thick with fear, seemed to breathe easier. The cartel that had once run the city was fractured, its leaders either dead, captured, or scattered. The government, in its desperate attempt to regain control, tried to project the image of a nation moving forward. But the shadow of Escobar lingered over everything. Escobar's reign had left a scar on Colombia that couldn't be easily erased. His empire had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of society that the remnants of it could be found on every street corner, in every corner of every barrio. The violence had been overwhelming: bombings, assassinations, the sheer terror that Escobar had instilled in the hearts of everyone. The fear that had once ruled the country did not simply vanish with his death. It left behind a legacy of broken lives, shattered families, and cities in ruins. Rebuilding wasn't just a matter of restoring physical structures, it was about healing the wounds of the people. Colombia had to face the reality of what Escobar had done to its society. The economy, once fueled by the illicit trade of cocaine, was in shambles. Medellin, once known as the heart of the drug trade, was now synonymous with death. The streets had been painted with blood, and no amount of reconstruction could erase the memories of the violence. The government, in collaboration with international forces, worked to dismantle what was left of Escobar's operations. But the deeper issue was the societal structure that Escobar had built. His patronage had bought loyalty from the poorest in the country, creating a network of dependents who still saw him as a hero. The people who had once viewed Escobar as a provider, a man who had given them schools and hospitals, were now faced with the reality that the same man had also brought chaos and devastation. The myth of Escobar, the Robin Hood figure, was harder to erase than the actual damage he had done. Medellin, in particular, struggled to break free from the grip of its own history. The streets still echoed with his name. Escobar's properties were either abandoned or repurposed, but the stories of the violence that had taken place there were still whispered in the shadows. The city tried to rebuild, but there was always a reminder: the murals that had once glorified his image, the ghostly presence of his legacy in the people who had once been loyal to him. For many, the man who had terrorized their city had been the one who had made them feel seen, and letting go of that was not so simple. Escobar's reign had destroyed much, but in its aftermath, Colombia had to learn to rebuild not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. The scars would remain for generations, as would the question of whether the country could truly move forward from the dark legacy he had left behind. In the years following Escobar's death, Medellin underwent a remarkable transformation. Once known as the epicenter of the drug trade and a symbol of violence, the city was determined to reinvent itself. The scars left by Escobar's reign were still visible, but there was an undeniable energy in the air, a collective drive to rebuild and redefine the identity of a city that had been associated with fear for far too long. The government, alongside local leaders and citizens, sought to turn Medellin into a place where the ghosts of the past could finally be laid to rest. The idea of the city as a war zone, plagued by violence and lawlessness, had to be replaced with a new narrative. This process wasn't easy, and it took years of conscious effort to shift perceptions both domestically and internationally. But slowly, Medellin began to shed its former skin, pushing past its violent past to embrace a future of innovation and opportunity. One of the key steps in the city's transformation was its efforts to become a tourist destination. What had once been a place tourists avoided due to its notoriety was now positioning itself as a model for urban renewal. The government, supported by local businesses, developed initiatives to promote Medellin as a city of culture, creativity, and resilience. The city's once grim neighborhoods were now home to art galleries, vibrant street murals, and museums showcasing the city's evolving identity. Walking tours were organized to highlight the city's struggle and its recovery, offering visitors a deeper understanding of its history while celebrating its resilience. The transformation also extended to Medellin's infrastructure. The once notorious favelas were being replaced with newly built public spaces, parks, and affordable housing. The city's public transport system was modernized with the introduction of the metro cable, a cable car system designed to connect remote areas to the rest of the city, symbolizing both literal and figurative elevation for its inhabitants. Medellin was no longer just a city ravaged by war. It was becoming a hub for innovation, technology, and education. New industries began to sprout, with a particular focus on technology and education. Medellin embraced its position as a growing center for entrepreneurship, attracting global companies, tech startups, and young professionals. Universities and research institutions took center stage, offering new opportunities for young people who had once been limited by the city's troubled past. The city's economic landscape was shifting from one based on illicit trade to one rooted in sustainable industries. proving that the old Medellin could no longer define the city's future. Yet, despite the forward momentum, the past was never truly forgotten. Medellin carried the memory of its violent history, honoring the victims of the drug wars and ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. The city's journey from a symbol of death and destruction to one of hope and progress was a testament to the resilience of its people. In the end, Medellin's rebirth wasn't just about transforming its physical spaces, but also its identity, one rooted not in fear, but in a powerful will to overcome. The death of Pablo Escobar didn't mark the end of Colombia's drug trade, nor did it signify the end of the cartel wars. Instead, it ignited a new phase. With Escobar gone, a vacuum was created, and smaller, more agile cartels quickly rose to take his place. The Colombian government and U.S. authorities may have celebrated the demise of Escobar's empire, but the streets were still teeming with the remnants of his legacy, and new players were eager to claim their piece of the lucrative drug business. These new cartels were different from the monolithic empire Escobar had built. They had learned from his mistakes, understanding the dangers of excess and visibility. They knew that survival in this game depended on staying under the radar and avoiding the mistakes that had led to Escobar's downfall. The major lesson from Escobar's reign was clear. Power could be fleeting, and those who made too much noise would eventually fall. While Escobar's cartel had been an empire built on sheer force, bombings, and fear, the new cartels were quieter, more methodical. They didn't seek public power or recognition. They understood that control over the cocaine market was all about logistics, discretion, and influence. Rather than large-scale violence, these cartels sought to control key transportation routes, bribe officials, and infiltrate government agencies with a level of subtlety Escobar never practiced. The Cali cartel, once a rival of Escobar's, played a central role in this shift. They had always been less flamboyant than Escobar, more focused on the business side of things. After Escobar's fall, they moved in quickly to absorb many of his former territories and operations. However, they too would eventually face their downfall, and with their collapse, even smaller groups sprang up, eager to carve out their share of the cocaine trade. The Colombian government, which had been stretched thin during Escobar's reign, found it difficult to combat the resurgence of the smaller cartels. The war on drugs was far from over. If anything, it had become more complex and insidious. While the cartels had grown more discreet in their operations, their ability to manipulate the system, both locally and internationally, meant that the drug trade continued to thrive. In the years that followed Escobar's death, the influence of his legacy remained. He had set a blueprint for success in the drug trade, one that was emulated by those who sought to take control of the industry. His methods of control, bribery, intimidation, and manipulation became lessons for a new generation of drug lords who understood that in this game, it wasn't about having the biggest empire, it was about lasting longer than your enemies. And though Escobar was gone, his empire still loomed large over Colombia's future, in ways both seen and unseen. In the years following Pablo Escobar's death, his legacy, far from fading, became a source of fascination and intrigue. The same streets that once bore the scars of his reign of terror now became the backdrop for a different kind of industry: tourism. Escobar had built an empire that was both deeply feared and oddly revered, and this duality began to shape how people viewed him in the wake of his fall. Some saw him as a ruthless criminal, while others viewed him as a misguided hero, a complex figure whose actions still resonated in the collective memory of Colombia. The tourism industry seized upon Escobar's larger-than-life persona. In Medellin, the city that had once been the epicenter of his empire, tours were created that took visitors to the places Escobar had frequented: his former mansions, the place of his death, and even his grave. These tours, though steeped in the shadows of violence, were sold as ways for tourists to understand the complexities of Colombia's past. It was a story of contrasts, one man's rise to power from nothing, a city's descent into chaos, and, eventually, a nation's struggle to rebuild. But with the commercialization of Escobar's life came a more uncomfortable truth. The line between remembering and glamorizing became increasingly blurred. For some, the tours became a spectacle, a way to walk in the footsteps of the notorious drug lord without truly acknowledging the destruction he had caused. The images of Escobar as a folk hero, a man who had built homes, schools, and hospitals for the poor, began to circulate in the media, offering a skewed narrative of redemption and righteousness. The myth of Escobar as a Robin Hood figure persisted, largely because it was more palatable than the terrifying truth of his brutality. Escobar's rise to power was far from romantic, but in the world of tourism, the focus shifted. Visitors were often drawn to the allure of the man who had once ruled with unchallenged power, eager to take photos in front of his properties, even as the bodies of those he'd killed lay in the dirt beneath their feet. The media only added fuel to the fire, turning Escobar into a symbol of rebellion and defiance against authority. Documentaries, books, and even TV shows like Narcos turned Escobar into a pop culture icon, his story retold and sensationalized for global audiences. This commercialization had its consequences. Many in Colombia viewed the increasing number of Escobar-related tours and media portrayals as an affront to the lives lost during his reign. The very same neighborhoods that had once been the heart of the violence now stood as relics of his power, with people still dealing with the scars he had left behind. For the victims of his empire, the myth of Escobar was a painful reminder of a past they couldn't escape, while for others, it was a story to be sold, consumed, and turned into profit. In the end, Escobar's legacy became a paradox, a story that was as much about the destruction of a nation as it was about its commercialization. The contradictions between remembering and glamorizing Escobar reflected the struggle of a country still coming to terms with its past. The media played an instrumental role in shaping the image of Pablo Escobar, elevating him from a feared drug lord to a larger-than-life figure whose name became synonymous with power, violence, and intrigue. In the years following his death, the media's portrayal of Escobar morphed into something more than just a recounting of his criminal deeds. It became a spectacle, a story ripe for the spotlight. Newspapers, television stations, and eventually streaming platforms seized upon the tale of Escobar's rise and fall, giving the world a lens through which to view Colombia's darkest chapters. Escobar's life, with its contrasts of opulence and bloodshed, became a story that people couldn't look away from. The media didn't just report on his criminal enterprises, they turned him into a myth. His story was sensationalized, making him a figure of both fascination and fear. The headlines chronicling his violent reign were met with just as much attention as the stories of his attempts to buy influence, from politicians to journalists, shaping his image as a man who could bend the system to his will. His infamous declaration that he was willing to negotiate with the government, even build his own prison, turned into a symbol of his power and arrogance. His defiance against the state and the public battles he fought with Colombia's law enforcement made him a pop culture icon, part villain, part anti-hero. Over time, Escobar became a cautionary tale. Yet even in his downfall, his story was captivating. The media's coverage of his eventual demise on a rooftop in Medellin sparked international headlines. But it didn't stop there. His myth continued to thrive. Documentaries and biographical books transformed him into an enigmatic figure, offering glimpses into the psyche of a man who had once controlled a vast network of drugs, violence, and fear. Netflix's Narcos series, while dramatizing his life, became a global phenomenon, cementing Escobar's place in modern pop culture. The character of Escobar, portrayed by Wagner Moura, became a symbol of ambition and excess, while his real-life counterpart remained a figure of enduring fascination. Yet, as the myth grew, so did the questions. The media blurred the lines between glorification and truth. In portraying his life, some outlets presented him as a master strategist, a criminal mastermind whose operations were far more intricate than anyone could have imagined. Others, more critically, highlighted his brutality, the deaths he ordered, and the destruction he wrought on Colombia. But regardless of the angle, Escobar's story captivated millions. Escobar's transformation into a pop culture figure is one of the most striking legacies of his life. He became a symbol, not just of the dangers of the drug trade, but of the allure of power and the corrupting influence of wealth. His name became a fixture in movies, TV shows, songs, and even memes. And as much as the media sought to turn him into a villain, they unwittingly ensured that his story would live on in the collective imagination forever, a part of global culture. The legacy of Pablo Escobar is a shadow that stretches far beyond his death, deeply embedded in the fabric of Colombia's society, affecting generations that came after him. For those who lived through his reign of terror, the scars are still visible, and the wounds are still healing. But for the younger generation, Escobar's story is something more complex, both a cautionary tale and a symbol of power that shaped their country's history in ways that are difficult to ignore. For many young Colombians, especially those born after his death, Escobar is a figure whose presence is felt in the streets, in the stories told by elders, and in the legacy of the cartels that followed in his wake. While they didn't witness his empire firsthand, they live in the aftermath, inheriting a country that was once ruled by his violence and greed. Escobar's influence is deeply ingrained in the urban landscape, from the neighborhoods he once controlled to the criminal networks that persist in the shadows. It's a world they've inherited, where the temptation of easy money still looms large, and the thirst for power can sometimes outweigh the desire for justice. Yet, Escobar's legacy is not entirely one of destruction. In the barrios where he once built houses and funded schools, some view him as a Robin Hood-like figure, a man who, despite his criminal ways, gave back to the people. For these young Colombians, Escobar represents both a symbol of what the poor can achieve and a reminder of how a man can rise from nothing to dominate the world. They may not approve of his methods, but they understand the pull of ambition, and in some twisted way, they see him as someone who, however flawed, changed the course of their lives and their city. However, not all young Colombians romanticize Escobar. For many, he is a symbol of the worst aspects of Colombia's past, a reminder of the violence, instability, and corruption that plagued the country. Escobar's reign created an environment where innocent lives were sacrificed on the altar of greed, and the wounds inflicted on Colombian society have yet to fully heal. To them, he represents a dark chapter in their nation's history, a chapter they wish to forget. They are determined to move forward, to build a future that is not defined by the chaos and bloodshed he left behind. As time goes on, Escobar's myth is perpetuated in both positive and negative ways. The media continues to romanticize his story, creating a narrative that some young people latch onto while others push back, determined to rewrite the history of their country without him. His influence, though, is undeniable. For better or worse, Pablo Escobar's empire will always remain part of the story of Colombia, and the generations that come after him will continue to grapple with his legacy, trying to make sense of the man who once controlled a nation and the world he left behind. Even though Pablo Escobar's reign has long since ended, his name lingers in the air of Medellin, whispered in conversations, etched into the city's very identity. His ghost is present in every corner, every street, and every story told by those who lived through it. Medellin, once known as the most dangerous city in the world, still bears the weight of his legacy. His empire may have crumbled, but the psychological and cultural scars he left are embedded deep within the collective memory of the people. Escobar's influence is felt in the city's rhythm, the pulse of its neighborhoods, the mindset of its inhabitants, and even the way people view authority and power. The younger generation may not have lived through his rule, but they inherit a city that still bears the marks of his empire. The wealth, the violence, the corruption, these are things they grew up hearing about. They are not just stories, but part of the fabric of their reality. It's as if Escobar's presence never truly left, as though his name became synonymous with both the city's glory and its agony. The psychological effects of Escobar's reign are difficult to quantify. For many, the fear and trauma of the past still linger, manifesting in the way people view their surroundings. For decades, Medellin was a city in constant turmoil, where violence was an everyday reality and life was fragile. It was a time when death could come in the blink of an eye, when trust was a rare commodity, and loyalty was bought with blood. These experiences shaped the psyche of the people, leaving them with a sense of uncertainty that still lingers today. The scars are not always visible, but they are felt in the quiet moments, in the hesitation before trusting others, and in the silent acknowledgement that the city is still recovering from the wounds inflicted by Escobar's empire. On the cultural front, Escobar's legacy is equally complex. For some, he remains a symbol of what is possible, a man who rose from nothing to build an empire, who was both feared and revered. His wealth and power, his ability to bend the government to his will, made him a mythic figure. For others, Escobar represents the darkest side of human nature, the corrupting influence of power, the price of ambition, and the destruction that follows when a man's hunger for control goes unchecked. Medellin has spent decades trying to reconcile these two versions of Escobar, trying to separate the man from the myth, and in some cases, trying to move on from both. Today, Escobar's ghost is not only a reminder of the city's violent past, but also a catalyst for change. Medellin has worked hard to redefine itself, to reinvent its identity and move beyond the shadow of its former king. But no matter how much time passes, Escobar's name will always be part of the story, a symbol of the highs and lows of the city's history, a reminder of what it once was and the long road it continues to travel. The lives of Pablo Escobar's children after his death have been marked by an overwhelming attempt to escape the shadow of their father. Born into a world of wealth and violence, Juan Pablo and Manuela grew up in the midst of a storm they had no control over. Their father's name carried power, fear, and a legacy that would forever define their lives. For them, the challenge was not just surviving, but trying to build an identity independent of the terror he left behind. Juan Pablo, who would later change his name to Sebastián Marroquín, he felt the weight of his father's empire from the very beginning. As a young boy, he experienced the kind of luxury and power that few could ever imagine, but it came at a cost. He was shielded from the worst of it, but even the most distant corners of his world could not escape the reach of Escobar's influence. His childhood was spent in hiding, moving from place to place, always under the protection of armed guards, always aware that the world viewed him through the lens of his father's crimes. As he grew older, the desire to break free from the past became overwhelming. Sebastián became determined to carve out a new path, to leave the weight of his father's name behind. He pursued architecture, and later became a vocal critic of his father's legacy. Through books, interviews, and documentaries, he worked to reshape the public's perception of the Escobar family, making it clear that he was not responsible for the actions of his father. He talked openly about the emotional and psychological toll of growing up in such an environment, the constant fear and trauma, the scars left on him by the violence and death that surrounded his father's empire. His journey was one of self-exploration, a search for peace and redemption in a life that had been marred by the past. For Manuela, the path was less public but equally complex. Growing up in the aftermath of her father's death, she found herself navigating a world that wanted to define her by her father's crimes. Escobar's death meant she could no longer live in the shadows of his empire, but the trauma of losing a father, who had been both a protector and a monster, left its own scars. Manuela has kept a lower profile, remaining largely out of the public eye, and has chosen to focus on a quieter, more private life. Still, her journey of healing mirrors her brother's in its attempt to carve a space for herself in a world that never allowed her to simply be a daughter, always an heir to a legacy too heavy to carry. Both children of Escobar, despite their different approaches, share one thing in common: a desire for normalcy, a desire to escape the suffocating grip of their father's name. In a world where their family history is forever etched in blood, they struggle to define their own paths, yearning for a life not dictated by the legacy of a man who once ruled an empire of terror. The myth of Pablo Escobar continues to cast a long shadow over Colombia, far beyond the days of his reign. Though the man himself is gone, the power he wielded, the charisma he exuded, and the empire he built continue to influence the political, social, and criminal landscapes of the country. Escobar's impact has proven to be a double-edged sword, shaping not only the past but also the present in ways that are impossible to ignore. In politics, Escobar's legacy lingers in the way some officials navigate power. His ability to use money and influence to manipulate politicians, police, and judges is a harsh reminder of how deeply embedded corruption runs in the fabric of Colombian society. While much has been done to eradicate the traces of his influence, the system that allowed Escobar to rise to power remains fractured. His playbook, built on violence, bribes, and fear, has been studied by many who seek to replicate his success in less obvious ways. Some politicians have even drawn from his playbook, quietly manipulating the system to further their own agendas, using the same tools of intimidation and bribery that Escobar perfected decades ago. The country may have moved on in many ways, but the scars left by Escobar's era of terror are still present in the veins of political power. In business, Escobar's name still holds weight. His fortune, once made through the blood of countless victims, still serves as a symbol of the extraordinary wealth that can be amassed through illicit means. For many, Escobar's ability to build an empire from the ground up, using an almost ruthless efficiency, is a source of fascination. Entrepreneurs in Colombia, particularly in the underworld, admire his shrewdness, his ability to navigate the law with a blend of charm and brutality. In some circles, Escobar's story is viewed as an example of raw ambition, where success is measured by the size of the empire, not the cost of lives. His influence remains in the way business is done in certain sectors, where power and money are still tied to the very same methods Escobar used to rule. The criminal world, too, has felt the enduring allure of Escobar's power. New cartels, though less visible and more calculated, look to Escobar as a model for success. His leadership style, his ability to cultivate loyalty and fear in equal measure, has inspired a generation of criminals. The violence he unleashed may have diminished in some parts of Colombia, but the methods of control he employed, cunning, fear, and power, still echo through the streets. Even in the modern drug trade, his name is invoked as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for achieving the impossible. Escobar's charisma, his larger-than-life persona, continues to captivate people's imaginations. In a country that has struggled with its identity in the wake of his reign, he has become both a symbol of the allure of power and the terrifying consequences of abusing it. The myth, much like the man himself, refuses to die. In the winding streets of Medellin, in the dark corners of criminal enterprises, and even in the halls of political power, Escobar's presence is still felt, his story told, and his legacy, however dark, remains. Pablo Escobar's life and death provoke deep reflection, not just on the legacy of a man who ruled with fear, but on the moral complexities that surround his actions. For many, he is the embodiment of pure evil, a villain whose reign left scars that still linger in Colombia. Yet, for others, he remains a figure caught in the gray area between villain and folk hero. The question that echoes in the aftermath of his death is whether the world can truly come to terms with the scale of his actions, or whether Escobar's myth will always overshadow the grim reality of his deeds. Escobar's empire was built on a foundation of blood, violence, and corruption. He used fear as a tool to enforce his will, sending waves of terror throughout Colombia. His cartel flooded the world with cocaine, but it was at an incredible human cost. The countless lives lost in his wake, the families destroyed by his wrath, and the children whose futures were stolen in the crossfire of his ambitions. Their stories are the unspoken casualties of Escobar's reign. Yet, even as he instilled terror, there are still those who view him with admiration, mainly for the wealth he brought to Medellin and the communities he protected through his acts of philanthropy. He built schools, hospitals, and homes for the poor, offering them a taste of the life they would never have without him. This stark contrast between his charitable acts and the brutality he inflicted fuels the moral debate about who Escobar truly was. The question of whether he was a product of his environment or a man who consciously chose to plunge into the depths of criminality also looms large. Escobar's rise was not a coincidence. It was the result of a system that was already rife with corruption, poverty, and inequality. In a country where opportunities were scarce, Escobar became a symbol of power and success, albeit through crime. Many argue that his actions were a direct response to a society that had left people like him with no other options. Was he a man who exploited these conditions, or did the conditions exploit him? It's a question that's difficult to answer in clear-cut terms. His hunger for power, his thirst for revenge, and his deep-rooted desire to carve his name into the history books turned him into a monster. But it was a monster born out of the very system he was trying to navigate. Escobar's death did not bring closure to the world or to Colombia. It ended a violent chapter, but the effects of his reign still ripple through society. The people who suffered under his hand are left with their wounds, but so too are the generations that followed, who grew up in the shadow of his myth. The reckoning lies in understanding that Escobar, for all his wealth and power, was also a man who could never escape the moral weight of his actions. He died a king, but not a hero, and in the end, his kingdom was nothing more than an illusion, a fleeting empire built on blood and deception. His death, though marked by the finality of a bullet, did not erase the damage he caused or the complexities of his existence. It simply left a silence, one that demands reflection, yet resists resolution. The end of Pablo Escobar's myth came not with the grand conclusion many imagined, but with the slow erosion of his legacy in a world that refused to stop turning. His death, while marking the end of an era in Colombia, did not instantly wipe away the impact he had on the country or the world. The myth of Escobar, one crafted from fear, power, and legend, lingered in the hearts and minds of many long after the final bullet had struck. It was a myth fueled by his relentless quest for power, his impossible ambition, and his brutal charm. But in the years that followed, that myth began to lose its grip. Escobar's death did not erase the destruction he had wrought, nor did it immediately bring peace to Colombia. The vacuum he left in his wake was filled by smaller cartels, many of which learned from his mistakes and continued the same brutal trade that Escobar had perfected. His rise and fall had shown the world the ease with which power could be gained and lost, but the lessons of his empire were not fully learned. In the years after his death, Escobar's influence remained in the shadows, where remnants of his empire lingered hidden in the politics of Colombia, in the quiet whispers of the cocaine trade, and in the lives of those who had once worked for him. As time moved forward, so did the world. Colombia, scarred by years of violence, began to rebuild itself. Medellin, the city once synonymous with fear and chaos, slowly started to shed its past. The streets, once marked by violence and the echoes of Escobar's reign, began to pulse with a new energy. The scars of the past were still visible, but they were being covered over by new industries, tourism, and hope. The myth of Escobar, though still alive in the stories told in dark corners and the media's obsession with his life, began to fade into something less significant. It became a part of the past, a relic of an older time, more a symbol of what had once been than a force that could still command attention. The media, once captivated by Escobar's every move, gradually shifted its focus. New stories, new criminals, and new heroes began to capture the public's imagination. Escobar's story was no longer fresh, no longer an urgent conversation. It became an archived narrative, a historical piece for documentaries and articles, but no longer the living, breathing myth that had once seemed so real. The pop culture fascination with Escobar, while still present in TV shows and films, grew increasingly disconnected from the reality of Colombia's present struggles. He had been a figure of power and terror, but in the face of time and progress, his myth began to lose its allure. The final dismantling of Escobar's legacy wasn't marked by a single event, but by the gradual fading of the attention he had once commanded. Colombia moved on, as societies do, and while his name would never be completely forgotten, it became increasingly irrelevant in a world that had learned to look forward, not backward. Escobar had built his empire on fear and charisma, but in the end, he was just another man who had fallen victim to the very thing he had used to control others' time. The world moved on, as it always does, and with it, the myth of Pablo Escobar slowly faded into the past. The night fell quietly over Medellin, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once consumed it. For years, the city had trembled under the weight of Escobar's empire, with gunfire echoing through its streets, the air thick with tension, fear, and violence. But with his death, something shifted. It wasn't a peace, but a pause. The relentless rhythm of terror, the daily threats to life, seemed to slow, as though even the earth itself took a deep breath, waiting for the dust to settle. Pablo Escobar, the man who had once ruled the city with an iron fist, had finally paid the ultimate price. His reign had been one of unimaginable wealth and destruction, a life that had begun in the slums and soared to unimaginable heights, only to plummet into darkness. But in the end, the king of cocaine, who had lived with a paranoia so deep, a mistrust so constant, that even his own shadow seemed a threat, found something more final than he had ever expected: peace. It was a peace born not of serenity, but of the end. After years of being hunted, pursued relentlessly by both enemies and allies alike, he had found his rest. It was a rest that no amount of money, no number of guards, no tunnels or hideouts could have granted him. Escobar had been a man who thought himself invincible, who saw himself as untouchable. His name, a symbol of power that stretched beyond the borders of his country. Yet in the end, he was just a man whose past had caught up with him, whose actions had left him with nowhere left to run. His final night was not marked by grandeur or fanfare, but by the stillness of death's quiet arrival. The echoes of his empire faded, the drugs, the violence, the fear all left behind. The world, once captivated by his larger-than-life presence, continued on without him, as if the universe had known that his time had come. In his death, the city of Medellin, once the heart of his rule, found a way to heal, slowly but surely. It was a healing that wouldn't come overnight, but it had begun, quietly and without the need for recognition. The streets, once filled with the sounds of gunfire, began to breathe a little easier. For Escobar, death was the one thing he could not control. It came for him not with the fanfare he had lived with, but with a simple finality. The king of cocaine had found his final night's rest, not in a grand palace or behind reinforced walls, but in a moment of stillness where even his restless soul could find the peace he had sought in all the wrong places. In death, as in life, Escobar had left behind a legacy, but it was no longer one of power. It was simply the story of a man who had once ruled everything only to lose it all, and in the end, find rest in the quiet of his own fall.